This episode is brought to you in part by Exoterra. If you're as passionate about reptiles and amphibians as I am, you know that quality matters. I use Exoterra products on all my reptile and amphibian enclosures, which is why I'm excited to be partnering with them. From naturalistic decor to innovative lighting and enclosures of all sizes, Exoterra has everything you need for your cold-blooded companions. Exoterra. Make your reptiles feel at home. This episode contains a paid sponsorship placement for True Chroma by Faunalux. Lighting reptiles isn't just about brightness or giving UVB, it's about illuminating the world that animals actually thrive in. Introducing True Chroma by Faunalux, a premium, revolutionary LED spotlight purpose-built for animals. Faunalux has worked with lighting experts and biologists to develop something totally new. Reptile Vision Technology, a bespoke single-source chip delivering high levels of visible light and proportional UVA1. That means your animals can get true full-color vision for the first time. Tried and tested by zoos, vets, and passionate keepers worldwide, True Chroma is now available at fauna-lux.com/expertidiot10 for 10% off your order today. True Chroma from Faunalux. Educated by nature. This episode is brought to you in part by Unlimited Exotic Pets. Every day is Veranda Day for Nick Lillis, and it shows. At Unlimited Exotic Pets, Nick produces high-quality monitor lizards with a deep commitment to ethical care practices and top-tier nutrition. These aren't just pets. They're responsibly bred, ethically raised animals. Whether you're looking for a new companion, starting a breeding project, or anything in between, Nick has you covered. Unlimited Exotic Pets, keeping and breeding quality without limitations. Love reptiles? Don't miss this. If you're passionate about reptiles, amphibians, and everything cold-blooded, Reptiles magazine is a must-have. Each issue is packed with expert care tips, stunning photography, and the latest news in the reptile world. Whether you're a seasoned herpetologist or just starting your reptile journey, this magazine has something for you. Subscribe today and stay informed on the best ways to care for your scaly friends. For only $14.99 a year, you can step outside your algorithm and get exposure to things that you wouldn't normally see or learn about. My family reads Reptiles magazine, and you should too. Visit subscribe.reptilesmagazine.com to get started. This is the Expert and the Idiot podcast. If you like the show and you'd like to support us, there's a link to our Patreon in the description below. Some benefits include getting access to new episodes up to a month in advance. There's also links to USARK and USARK Florida. If you're not already a member, please sign up. Enjoy the show. All right, welcome to episode 68 of The Expert and the Idiot. Today I'm joined by Dr. Warren Booth, Jason Raimondi, and Brian Vuillemenot. Today we'll be talking boa care, feeding, growth, health, species and locality, purity, morphs. Maybe we'll get into the future of the hobby. This is the boa Symposium. I don't think I could think of three better guys to talk boas with. So I'm glad we could make this happen. And yeah, I mean, I guess what we'll do is we'll hop right into it. I think that one of the biggest things is that you see talked about most often is feeding and growth. It seems like it's just like such a constant thing, and I feel like, you know, maybe it's inexperience. You know, inexperienced keepers just, you know, they want to make sure that they're doing right by the animal. But when would you guys, how sparingly should you, and actually let me rewind a little bit. A lot of these questions came from Patreon members. A lot of them came from Nisarg Shah and Ish Quinonez. So we've got some great, well thought out questions here. So how sparingly do you feed an adult boa? So you have a fully grown boa, or I mean, as close to fully grown as possible, an adult boa, how often are you going to feed that animal?
Do we go in order?
Whoever wants to go first. Jason,
Brian,
go ahead.
all right. So I think we'll all have similar but different opinions on this. And I like talking about this, but I hate talking about this because in my opinion, there's no one size fits all. And keeping versus breeding, I think those are two different topics. I mean, I feed my boas that if I were to recommend this person is never going to breed, it's just purely a pet, I'm going to recommend something different than what I would do because I'm food cycling and I'm messing around with temperatures and the frequency of food. So for my just pure adult boas, if I were a pet keeper, I would say, and I feed fairly small. I will rarely feed something that puts a giant lump in an animal. But if it's putting a lump that maybe lasts a day or two, I'm going to feed my males as a pet keeper about every 3 weeks, and my females about every 4-ish weeks. But I'm looking at the animals. Some animals might need a little bit more. Some animals may need less. I have one female that if I feed that thing, 6 months later, she looks like she lost no weight at all. And I have another one, if I don't feed that thing every month, it looks like it's dramatically losing weight. So every animal, just like people, are different, even within the same litters. So it depends. If I'm breeding, I'm going to go through the natural cycle where I'm going to my adult females and males. I might feed every 2 weeks in the summertime, but then in the wintertime, I'm going to taper them off and they may get every 2 to 3 months. So it depends on the time of year. So I wish I could give you a straightforward, this is the chart to follow, but I don't have a chart. I try to give guidelines. That's the hardest part about YouTube is I want to give people the information. And Brian, you probably have the same experience. You want to give people the information, but there's no one size fits all for every snake, for every
person. Yeah, no, I have a basic guideline that I give, but it's just a starting point. And, as you said, Jason, it depends on the situation. It definitely depends on the animal because I try to feed just to maintain a lean but muscular body shape. And, depending upon the time of year, going into the breeding season, I want my females to be kind of chunky so they can get through the winter fast. And some of them don't eat when they're gravid. So that could be, 4 or 5 months without eating. So I'll definitely, kind of put the weight on them during the summer. I'll feed as often as every 2 weeks if needed in adult females that are getting ready to go into breeding. I have one female, an Argentine that is about 5 or 6 years old that I think is still growing and she's getting a little chunky. So I'm probably going to cut her back, but I was feeding her like every 2 weeks for a while, a few months just to get her ready because I want to breed her next year. It's definitely good to, for breeding, of course, to cycle them with food and not feed for, about 2 months or so is typically what I do in the winter. And then when they're going into breeding, they're not eating as much. They're eating maybe once a month. I always tell people for starting off for babies about every 2 weeks is a good rule of thumb. But even that's not absolute. I mean, it's some of the babies that grow fast or some of the morph boas can be fed every 10 days or even so, about that, true reptiles less common, a lot less frequent about every 2 weeks. But it all varies, and people either want to feed too much or they don't want to feed enough. That's what I've seen, and either of those is not a good idea. And you go from power feeding to extreme slow growing, and those are both not good ideas in my opinion. Especially for breeding, getting animals ready for breeding.
Yeah, Dr. Booth.
I think these guys have kind of summed up what I do as well. I've been in the 30 years that I've been breeding boas. What I do is I stop feeding from the beginning of November. I start feeding again at the beginning of March, so they don't get anything in that period. And I start pairing things together around November, December. Whenever it's a normal boa, and all boas get that, whether it's for breeding or just for regular, just like for pets. What I tend to do is I feed females about every 4 weeks. So, all of my Colombian boas are not here. They're at a friend's place, but all of my Central American boas, they're all maxing out about 5.5 feet. They will get a larger jumbo rat for a female once every 4 weeks. The males are small, they get maybe a small rat every 3 weeks.
Wow.
What I do differently is that in about 6 weeks prior to stopping feeding, I'll feed smaller meals more frequently. So I'll give the females a medium rat or a large rat, depending, about every 2 weeks. It just puts a little bit of extra weight on them leading up to that period where they're going to fast because they'll fast for 4 or 5 months. And then if the females grab it, there's another, 90 days, 104 days, whatever, 120 days where they're gravid. So they're not feeding for a long period of time. For babies, I start off about every 5 to 10 days, depending. I like to get them established really quickly. And if they have a couple of meals over the space of about 6 weeks where they're getting frequent meals, that seem to kind of gets them solid and kind of ready to go. And then they get cut back about every 10 days. So it's, but for, as I say, for a large boa, maybe 8 meals a year, 9 meals a year, is pretty much what they get.
It seems like generally there's a pretty huge size difference between the males and females. When are you guys slowing down your males? When are you cutting back on their food?
I don't slow down. I just I regulate the size that they get. If it's a male, they're always being raised as a male. I'm not pushing them, and I don't push females anyway. I'm not breeding females until they're 5 to 7 years old. But that's probably why I also have females that are in their 20s that are still breeding. A number of years ago when I lived in Raleigh, I was donated a boa that was at least 43 years old. And it had been captured as a wild caught at 3 or 4 feet long. And it was fed by the guy for 30 years. He fed it one squirrel that he shot in his backyard every month.
Where was that boa caught?
It was a Central America, or it was a South American, a Colombian.
Colombian, okay.
Yeah. And it was amazing. I'll have to find pictures of it because it is.
Did it get big if it was that old, or did it?
No. It was probably about 7 feet, 6.5, 7 feet, and kind of nice, kind of loaf bread shape. She wasn't fat. And its face had all turned orange. I always wondered whether as snakes age, whether they you'll get pigmentation change, the way a lot of animals do. This had a really orange face. I tried to breed it a couple of times, but it never took. But it would feed once a month on a rat. It's great. I then donated it to a reptile rescue to be used for a display to show how old boas can get. But yeah, as I say, I don't really change my feeding style. I just know that it's a male, they're getting raised on smaller meals. It's a female, they tend to grow faster, larger, and they get fed appropriately. Like I'm opposite to Jason, where I feed larger meals less frequently. So if a female will take a large or a jumbo rat, then that's what she'll get. And a month to 6 weeks later, she'll get another.
Wow. Jeez Louise. So you're doing every 4 to 6 weeks?
Yeah, depending on the female. Yeah. But that's the same with my emerald tree boas, like my emeralds, the females will get a large rat once every 4 to 6 weeks. The males will get a small rat every, 3 weeks, 2 weeks.
Now, obviously you guys are both successful. What do you think, what's your thought process behind the two different methods?
I think boas are adaptable. Yeah, I mean, it's these animals live, millions of square miles in the wild, and all different environments, all different food sources. They get to different sizes. I mean, they're very good generalists that can do well in a variety of different environments. So it's not surprising that they can do well with a variety of different, husbandry approaches.
Think about how a lot of these animals are surviving in the wild. You look at something like a crawl K, Cotter's K, Western K snake, they're feeding on finches or passerine birds that are migrating, and they're feeding maybe twice a year, but they're gorging. They're feeding, and I've seen this in other animals. I got womas that have hatched recently, and, you open up a case, they're wanting to feed every time you open up that tub. And I think the same thing happens with these boas on islands. They're getting small meals, and they're digesting them rapidly, and they're feeding frequently, but then they're fasting for 8 months. That's different than a boa that's on Costa Rica, where during a large part of the season they've got an abundance of food. They'll feed probably less frequently, but they feed for a longer period of time throughout the year before they fast. I think, Brian's right, boas are very adaptable. And I think the way I keep my boas is probably very different than the way Jason and the way Brian keep their boas, but we're all successful in our own ways. I think once they adapt to our room and our conditions, they do pretty well.
And this is interesting because I just want to sit here and listen. I just want to hear what
I really appreciate you putting this together, Adam. This is a great resource for all of us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's my pleasure. Thanks for everybody agreeing and coming in on it. What are your guys' thoughts on power feeding and people that are trying to get their animals up to size quickly? Do you think that that's short-sighted and you're just shortening the life of the animal, or do you think that there's merit to that technique?
So I've seen people do it, and generally they're not successful. Maybe they will eventually, but a lot of the times, at least the ones that I've seen do it, specifically at scale, sometimes they're successful. Most of these animals are not as reproductive, and they end up dying before they become reproductive. With boas, it's usually the python keepers who try to push that on, but you can even kill pythons by doing the same thing. I mean, Burmese pythons are, in my experience, it's not uncommon to see Burmese pythons thrive until they're about 2-3 years old and then just end up dead one day in the cage. And the same thing, and I believe that's because they digest faster, or at least visually they digest faster. So it's easier to, hey, this boa is looking for food, or this Burmese python's looking for food again. But I think when you do that with boas, it's not. You just have to be patient. It's you try to shortcut by getting them to size faster, and you still end up taking 3, 4, 5 years to get them, and sometimes even longer. From what I've seen, it kind of throws off their reproductive cycle by trying to force that growth quickly. Uh, and one thing is, I think, a differentiator between Warren and I is that and I could be completely wrong, Warren, but what you said is I take these animals and say there's nothing natural about what I'm doing here. Even if I give them these ideal cages, like what you have behind you, Adam, still not natural. So I can control their feeding cycle. And although there may be a twice a year migration of finch, and these boas gorge themselves, is that what is best for the longevity of the animals? Maybe. I don't know. But I try to think in long term. I mean, I have a few 30-year-old boas, or at least close to it, and they're still, one of them's pregnant right now. So I think you can get to the same place by doing different methods, and that's why there's so much debate around the feeding component. Is everybody feels differently. They all have these strong feelings, and I like what Brian said, is that a lot of people either power feed or underfeed, and they can't find that balance in between. But I think there's a lot of different ways to get to the same end result. And with social media, everybody has a voice now. So everybody wants to be right. Even somebody who has a 6 months experience, there's nothing wrong with that. They probably have a perspective that I could learn from. So I like to listen to that. But a lot of these folks have that voice, and they're giving those contributions on Facebook and different social media platforms. And that's what causes the debate. Is you can get to the same place by, even if you were to power feed, you could probably get to the same place, but there's repercussions to that. And at some point, there's more risks with that power feeding. So could you power feed? Probably. Are you going to risk the health of your animal? Yes. But you could still take that method if you really wanted to. You may kill your animals in the process.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, the classic definition of power feed, more than once a week or more. And back in the day, I think they used to stick a second rat in the snake's mouth as the first one was going down. And yeah, I mean, I have to say that's really not a good idea at all. And I think that's probably one thing that most people can agree on, is that like extreme power feeding. I think the only thing that the person could potentially do is get a big snake in a short period of time, but it's probably not going to live very long. And I would certainly say that the long-term reproductive success is going to be reduced. You might have a litter or two, but probably not going to live very long. And I've never done it, but from what I've heard, and you're going to have much smaller litters, and they're not going to be nearly as successful. Yeah, I mean, we could talk. I don't want to change the topic here, but Jason brought up social media, which is definitely a heated topic, and there's all kinds of opinions on there, and some of them are great, some of them not so great. I think it's important for people in general to just find their own way. I mean, start with get information you trust, go to sources, books, podcasts, videos, etc., that you trust. But you have to kind of see what works for you, and it's going to be different everywhere, I mean, the
Yeah.
local environment in my snake room in California is not going to be the same as, Jason in New England, or Warren, I think you're in Virginia, yeah. And, and Adam in Florida, three, totally different environments. And the snakes are going to become locally adapted to the conditions there.
Mm.
So it's going to be a little bit different. And then, we're keeping them in different setups. So I think the longer you have a group together, a breeding group in captivity, and the more generations, I think they just become more and more adapted to the local conditions. And if you just stick with a project and take it into multiple generations, you can, ultimately be really successful. I've had other projects that I'm not successful in a single generation. That just, for whatever reason, but that's breeding boas. There's, as I always say, there's no guarantees breeding boas.
Yeah. Warren, what are your thoughts on power feeding?
So one thing we know physiologically is it's pretty stressful, right? So in the work that's been done on pythons and on pit vipers, we know that within a 2-week period, for a 2-week period, you get a massive upregulation of genes that result in the heart doubling in size, the blood thickening, the massive intestinal remodeling occurring. So physiologically, there's a lot of stress that feeding actually puts on a snake, on a python or a boa or a pit viper. Not the same for colubrids. Colubrids don't have that same mechanism. And this happens within 4 hours of feeding. So within 4 hours of feeding, everything starts ramping up. And that's physiologically very energetic and physiologically very stressful. So if you're continuing to keep that animal in that upregulated state by feeding it frequently, then you're putting a lot of stress on organs, specifically the heart, the liver, and the intestines. And I think that's why you see a lot of these power-fed animals that are dying within 5, 6, 7 years, even during if they're gravid. I think allowing animals to naturally go through that cycle is a lot more realistic. Even these island boas that are gorging for a month, it's only for a very short period of time that they're in that upregulated, relatively stressful state. For a lot of the rest of the time, everything atrophies back down to its regular size. So I think power feeding is generally pretty detrimental, right? We know people like Peter Kyle raised up had albinos within 18 months and produced from them. And I've seen people doing that, but I've also seen a bunch of people on YouTube that are raising up animals that are hets for some specific traits that breed them within 2 years and they get whole litters of slugs because they're breeding obese animals for their size. I think reproductively that's not very good, and health-wise for the animal in general it's not very good. So I tend to avoid it. But even I think back 30 years ago, talking to some breeders, their term that they always used was you got to feed them to breed them. And they would feed every week. They would be feeding on the exact same day, the exact same time, the exact same meal. And I think over time I've realized that that's probably not the best way to maintain my animals, which is why I've got animals that I brought over to the US 20 years ago when I moved here. They're still breeding. I've got 3 of them that are gravid in my basement at the moment. And they produce for me, 4 or 5 times in that 20-year period as well. What's also interesting is some of these breeders that would feed very heavily, there was one that had a video that was put out that would say that big boas only had 3 reproductive events in them. And I totally disagree with that. I've got animals that have had 7 or 8 litters and they're still looking really healthy. And it's because I think they're fed more sparingly, more naturally, and they're not physiologically stressed at the same level that power feeding does. But then again, I'm doing this as a hobby. I'm not doing this as a business where I'm trying to get animals up to size quickly and to try and, catch up with the current morphs and so on. That's the current trend.
I have a question for Warren because I have assumptions, but I don't have any scientific backing behind it. So do you think that, or that same physiological effect that happens in those studies when I read them, they're feeding a really large male size, like 25% of the body weight. So a 10-pound animal is getting a 2.5-pound rabbit. Do you think they would get that same physiological effect for the same duration if you fed that 10-pound animal, let's say, a half-pound rat? Or because that was my assumption, which is why I generally feed smaller. And I don't want to say more frequently because it's still not super frequent, but I generally feed smaller more often than some. Like, for instance, my babies I feed weekly, and then I'll give it a couple weeks off. So I'm still skipping. I'm not feeding every Friday. They're getting a meal. It might be Friday, then I might skip 2 weeks. But do you think they would have that same blood thickening, heart enlargement that you would have with a massive meal with smaller meals? Do you know of any set studies around that?
Yeah, not a lot. The reason being is that the researcher that was doing a lot of that work had a massive stroke and is no longer able to do any research,
All meals.
which is really sad. But
Yeah.
what I would like to have seen would have been studies that showed different age classes. So if we fed, from what I know from talking to him, it didn't matter whether it was a small meal or a large meal. Within 4 hours, you got that upregulation, and that remodeling was occurring. I don't think they collected enough data to suggest that it might last for a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, depending on the meal size. You can imagine a lot of it's driven by this extension or distension of the gut. Whenever that happens, it's probably resulting in hormonal changes that kick in these rapid upregulation of genes. So I don't know, but I'm like you with babies. I feed every 7 days. Sometimes I feed every 5 days, but I give them 2 or 3 weeks off. I don't have a feeding schedule. I don't. I just, when I remember, I feed them. But I tail that off as they get, less than a year old, and they're getting that 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever. And they still grow. Like, one of the things that I've always said to people is boas seem to grow really well when you don't feed them. They put on length, and then for a period of time when you're feeding them more, then they start girthing and bulking up. But I think that's a really good question. And sadly, I don't think there's any work that's been done since the last 5 years, since Stephen had a stroke, or 4 years that has extended that work on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. I'd be interested to see if some of the island boas have a different, metabolic response to rapid feeding than maybe some of the mainland boas, and if that's an adaptive response to the local abundance or the seasonal abundance of food.
Is there a difference between feeding boa sigma, imperator, and constrictor in your opinion, or would you feed them all the same, or would you change it?
I think they don't feed constrictor anymore. And years ago they were a lot more sensitive whenever they were mainly wild caught. I've worked with captive bred for a short period of time, but with sigma and with imperator, I think they're pretty rock solid. They're the standard kind of boa. They do what you want them to do. But I think Brian might be more attuned to constrictor and their feeding habits.
I'd say boa constrictor is definitely the most fragile as far as feeding. I don't, it's extremely rare to get regurgitation in other types of boas in my experience, but with the baby constrictors, if they're fed too much or it's too large, or, sometimes you just have a period where an animal is just going through a regurgitation at, 6 months or so. Everything seems fine, and then it regurgitates. And, typically if you just don't feed it for, 4 weeks or so, it's fine after the next feeding. But they just, in general, they're a lot more fragile. They absorb the food a lot worse. A baby or a 1-year-old Suriname is not that big. They'll put on maybe 3-4 inches. I have baby 1-year-old imperators and even other constrictors like the occidentalis that will get to be at least twice as large in a year. They're up to 2.5 feet or so. But the boa constrictor, that's the number one issue with captive true red tails is they're just fragile as far as the absorbing food, and you have to be really careful, especially for the first year, not to get into a regurgitation cycle.
So one thing I've been thinking about recently relating to that is hydration. So I work with a lot of emerald tree boas, a lot of corralis in general, and you find this trend of people talking about emeralds regurgitating and regurgitation syndrome. I think a major driver of that is that the animals are dehydrated. And I think the same thing probably happens with Suriname, Guyana red tails. I question whether hydration comes into it at that point as well. So it's for example, whenever I bring in wild-caught emeralds for the first 6 weeks, I have them in a dark enclosure where they're just getting hydrated, arboreal water bowls, fresh water every day. And I don't even think about offering food. And whenever I do offer food, they get a food item that's appropriate for their size. They don't get these tiny little meals. I don't see regurgitations. I see people that bring in animals in the same shipments, that put them straight into enclosures and start offering food, and then they regurgitate immediately. I think that if you look at humans that are dehydrated have intestinal problems. And I think some of the regurgitation that we've seen in constrictor could be related to hydration issues. But I don't have any data to support that, but I think about that a lot with emeralds.
That makes me think about the occidentalis that I got in that started regurgitating. It makes me wonder if maybe they were dehydrated from the trip, if it wasn't necessarily because they took the food, they were all about eating. But then, 4 or 5 days later, the regurgitation happened. And, since that couple incidents, for both of them, they're totally fine and slamming rats as often as they can get them.
I've noticed that mine are even litter dependent. So, for instance, I've had Perus in the past, and those things were like tanks. Indestructible. You could feed this thing a massive meal. But my most recent litter of Perus this year, they were much more sensitive, and I had to start them small. Hydration conditions are essentially the same as they've always been, as far as I can tell. From the hydration perspective, but maybe they're not drinking the water bowls as frequently. So there could be that. That's an interesting component in there. But I have Northern Brazils, and they're much more sensitive. I did not produce those. I purchased them, and I have some Surnames, and the Surnames are like little tanks as well. You could feed the heck out of them, and they just will not regurgitate. I have Central American boas that will regurgitate before the Surnames and Perus. But I feel like it's litter dependent. I've had other Suriname boas, and you feed them something that's just putting a small visible lump for a few hours, and they'll throw that up because the rat will expand over a couple of days. It could even be the rat, the food that the rodents are eating, that is just disrupting their stomach. I don't know, but yeah, Brian, you'd probably have the most experience.
I've seen exactly the same thing, Jason, where some litters seem to be more susceptible, and it seems to be related to certain bloodlines. I think I don't want to I'm not exactly sure, but I had a Guyana red tail, which in my mind is basically synonymous with the Suriname, and that one, for whatever reason, I had a few small litters, and most of them regurgitated at some point. Whereas I've had other Surinames that are just like tanks; they just don't regurgitate. And I know I've have some Venezuelans. I haven't had any issues regurgitating, but my friend Michael Beach has told me that he's seen some regurgitations in the Venezuelans. So it just depends, but I think there might be a genetic component. It might be related to the local microenvironment and the facility that they're in. I think the stress, this often happens when a boa is shipped. So I think people get their new boa, they're all excited to feed it, and then they let it acclimate for a few days and then give it a meal, and it's also the stress that can induce this. And then finally, I think the food. We're giving them lab grown rodents primarily, and they're probably higher in fat than the wild caught food in the wild, and they're some people swear by rats, some people swear by mice. I haven't really seen any convincing arguments that one is necessarily better than the other. I'd be, really interested to hear what you guys have to say about that. But it can just be hard sometimes with baby Surinames because they are more susceptible to the regurgitation.
I recently
things there, Brian, that interest me. One is you said you see it in certain bloodlines. So whenever I hear the word bloodline, I hear inbreeding, right? So I'm totally against bloodlines because I've got some friends that have their own bloodlines and stuff. But bloodlines to me is selective breeding, and it's continual inbreeding. And while people think that reptiles are very resilient to inbreeding, I think that's not the case. I think animals on islands that have got small population sizes that have existed for tens of thousands of years have seen selection events that have selected for individuals that are adapted to those conditions, but I don't think that happens in a short period of time in captivity. And we're often selecting the worst animals, right? You see the really weakly sick one in the litter, but it looks really cool because it's got a neat pattern and you do everything to keep it alive, right? That's probably not going to survive in the wild. It's probably detrimental. So I think inbreeding can have an effect. It could be selecting for genes that have reduced ability for metabolism. We see that in lots of stuff. In the insects that I work on in the lab, we see lines that once you start inbreeding, they digest food worse. Their reproductive fecundity drops dramatically. Their longevity drops dramatically.
That's interesting, Warren.
The other thing that you mentioned was feeding them different meal or feeding them rats. Now, one thing I've thought about recently is you see a regurgitation within 4 days. Within 4 days, that's not enough time for the rat to be digested. It's not even enough time for the digestion to reach the gut. So there was talk recently about emerald tree boas and how they can be saved by feeding the rodents a fruit diet. I think that's complete nonsense and I've kept and bred emeralds for 30 years. And I've seen regurgitation in babies through adults that are fed chicks, rats, mice, African soft furs, hamsters, gerbils, whatever, all fed on different diets. And any regurgitation that happens within a period of time where they just about start digesting around the head region. It's nowhere near the gut. It's never open. So I question whether the fat content or even the species is really the issue. I think there's a more sinister kind of issue that's happening with animals that are regurgitating. And I think inbreeding could be part of it. I think humidity could be part of it. And even people used to talk about temperature, the temperature that we keep our animals. A lot of times in captivity, we keep them a little bit too hot. And that can certainly lead to potential regurgitation issues. But I think then people keeping it the opposite end of the extreme and keeping them too cold means that they can't thermoregulate to allow them to digest food, to move between hot and cold zones to allow them to digest. So I think it's a really complex question. I think it's individual specific. I think it's room specific. I think it's region specific. It's species specific. I think there's not one silver bullet that addresses everything. But what you can do with an animal that regurgitates, you can actually at least help reseed the gut flora. There's things like NutriBac and stuff like that you can use that will help regrow gut flora relatively quickly. The problem is that you're adding a gut flora to an animal that might not naturally have that gut flora, and it's going to lead to competition between the current flora and the flora that you add to it. So that can lead to problems, but there are ways to help it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Jason, do you want to
go?
I don't want to change the topic because we could talk about this topic for 20 minutes or half an hour, but inbreeding is another topic I would really like to cover and hear everybody's thoughts and opinions, because one of my worries being a locality person is the small gene pools that we have, and with an island boa, as Warren mentioned, maybe it's not as big of a deal because we're talking about very small wild gene pools. But some of the other localities, like I've heard, for example, that the Tarahumara boas might be descended from as few as 2 animals in captivity. Yeah. So Warren can confirm that. But are we viewing these as almost like an island boa because they live in environments they're isolated, and they're naturally inbred in these wild mountain environments in Mexico? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's the way we need to think about it. People, whenever they hear the term island, they think landmass surrounded by ocean. But an island is simply a habitat that's isolated, right? And when you look at these sky island boas, they're in a small region that is isolated. They can't get off these islands. And they've been isolated there for tens of thousands of years. And over that time, you've had selection events. You don't get migration into the island, right? Because boas are simply not doing that. But you get selection for genes that are locality suited to local selection.
One interesting thing that I was going to mention is that the first few generations of Peru that I had were different parents, different imports, bred together. And they had those are the ones that I said they were like tanks. The latest one I did baby to mother, and that's when I saw the gut issues. So maybe there's something genetically not working there. Maybe it is the inbreeding, because they can't be that sensitive that one generation away, but maybe they are. It's just an interesting correlation. Could have nothing to do with anything about these. It could just be weaker babies. They're perfect now and they're powering through it, but I did have to feed them smaller meals. And even within the same litter, some of them were perfect right from the start and others were a little weaker, which makes sense. Naturally, you're going to have 20 boas and some of them are not going to make it through whatever means. They just didn't develop the same way. So it's inbreeding could be a component. And I do think it's
with inbreeding. Think about with one pair of adults that are related, the combination of genes that you can have for specific genes that are important. You've got multiple different combinations, so you could have, if they were heterozygous, essentially at a gene that impacted digestion, and you have 2 parents who are heterozygous, you can have some offspring that are homozygous that are wild type and healthy. You can have ones that are homozygous that have both. The mutation in both copies. You have some that are heterozygous, and that could result in change and variation with the litter. So I think there's still something to it, but it just hasn't been addressed.
Question I want to give to you guys here. We're moving kind of slow, which is fine. We're we're still in topic number 1 though, and I had 10 here, which is good. But I want to jump ahead to a question. You guys know that I love Argentine boas. Should they be considered their own separate species, or do you think that they should be a subspecies of constrictor?
They're their own. We're doing a bunch of genetic work now on the phylogenetics, phylogeography of boas as kind of some side projects in relation. We're also part of a group that are sequencing the boa genome to chromosome scale. And it's going to be a Costa Rican T positive that's used to make that. Well, that's what we've used to make the new genome. But when you look at the phylogenetic relationships of boas across the range, we're going to see further splitting occurring. But Occidentalis is certainly its own species, just like Nebulosa, just like Oropius. They just haven't had the rigorous molecular work published yet that shows that. Yeah, they're very different animals. Even the way they breed, the way they, you see these, they breed almost like anacondas. We can get multiple males in the wild. You'll find them in this breeding mass. They survive very cold temperatures. They're very different animals.
Yeah, and I mean, just their short, stubby tail. It's bizarre how stubby their tail is. They're so wildly different. I'm surprised that they're not their own thing.
Yeah, but look at some of the closely related species too. The things like Amarali, they're just the same. They've got short, stubby tails, and they're almost like Occidentalis on a shrunken scale. It's like different heads.
Yeah, looking at the Amarali, to me, those are kind of like they have some of the markings and behavior or body of the constrictor, but then they have the short tail like the Occidentalis. So I mean, do you think those are maybe like intermediate between the two? How much would you divide boas as far as species? I mean, like even like different, if we call it boa constrictor, is there any merit for potentially having, Western South American constrictor is different from ones from the Guyana Shield?
So there was a paper out recently that added a new species of Boa atlantica, something like that there, which is from the western part of South America. I think it's just a lot of it has actually had rigorous molecular work done. What we're doing now to identify species is very different than what was done a handful of years ago, where you could use 1 or 2 genes, mitochondrial genes, and say that was the story. But now, we're looking at whole mitochondrial genomes and thousands of nuclear genes to actually tell us what's happening. So I think that there hasn't really been any work published to show further splitting, but I think it's as we delve more into the genetics of species or of populations, I think we're going to start pulling out more of what we consider a species. The big question is, what do we consider a species? Years ago, when you looked at all of the early work done on butterflies, on Heliconius and so on, they said that I think it was 2%, anything above 2% sequence divergence was a species. We've done work on insects where we find 1.2% sequence divergence, and that's clearly a different species. We're doing work on scrub pythons, locality scrub pythons, where we're finding 5 to 7% sequence divergence between animals on the same landmass, where you're finding 1.8% sequence divergence between animals that are separated by tens of thousands of years on islands. So it's a very difficult kind of question. You'll get people that want to lump species together, people that want to split species. And I think basically the way we are putting it forward is that whenever you can create a phylogenetic tree that shows strong clades that are separated, you can pretty much identify those as being genetically distinct lineages and therefore likely species. Whenever you get the branch lengths that are really compressed, then you're probably into the subspecies kind of category.
With Suriname and Guyana boas being so similar, how often do imports get mislabeled, do you think?
I think all the time. Look at what's happening with Corallus ruschenbergeri coming into the US. There's no export permits for Corallus ruschenbergeri. They don't exist in Guyana, but they're being sold as Guyana ruschenbergeri. I think they just happen to drift their way across through collectors' hands from Venezuela into Guyana. I think the same thing happens whenever you're at some of the collection areas.
Yeah, I think you have to take any locality information skeptically, other than if you have something like an island boa that's, very distinctive. There's no way you can prove. I mean, I have boas that are supposedly Suriname. There's no way I know 100%. They look like Suriname. I have, people I trust have told me this, but ultimately I can't be sure where the founder animals were collected in the wild. And, you know, in captivity, of course, it's getting worse with people misrepresenting data. And, you know, yeah, I don't know. We could go on to the bloodline topic because that's another interesting topic. I've got a lot of, you know, topics I'd love to discuss with you guys. I don't know how many of them we're going to get to in the next 2 hours, but yeah.
Yeah, we can go on to that. One thing I just want to say real quick is Dr. Stephen Tillis has he's line breeding ball pythons, which I think is the coolest thing in the world. They're like just normal ball pythons, and he has the GPS coordinates from where he collected those. And I just think that's really awesome. Eric Kohler has, I think, a pair or a trio as well of those.
And realize that it's interesting to about 0.002% of the ball python population breeders. You know, they don't give a stuff about where the animal was collected. If it doesn't have the genes they want, they don't care.
Yeah.
You know, another thing with this locality thing is, you know, we're thinking about locality in terms of space, but you have to think about it in terms of time. I mean, populations in the wild are always changing. So, you know, what is representative of a particular boa now it might be different 20, 30, 40 years from now, might be different from what it was 100 years ago. And I bring this up, you know, for if you're just talking about, you know, a Guyana shield boa or, you know, a Peruvian boa, something like that, that's one thing. But if you're trying to identify like the specific latitude and longitude down to like the exact village, I mean, it's something I think of as a micro locality where maybe you're finding something or representing something that's not really real. You know, I mean, we like to think it's real as far as collectors, that we have these ultra specific animals. But as far as the biology, I mean, how much different is that from an animal that was collected, you know, 20 or 30 miles away? You know, how much different is it going to be over time? Those are things I think of a lot. I mean, I don't think there's any easy answers, but and then, you know, our locality populations in captivity are certainly changing generation to generation, whether we like to, you know, try to control it or not. It's just going to happen as a result of just being in captivity. And, you know, animals that do well in captivity are being selected for, which are going to be different from those in the wild. So I think anybody that has a locality collection that's, you know, a few generations removed and is representing it as 100% pure and representative of the wild population is just kidding themselves.
Yeah, I think a big part of that, Brian, is that because I breed locality boas, and I'm prone to this myself. Whenever you get a litter and you want to hold back something, you hold back the best of the animals, and they're probably not representative of what you find in the natural population. You know, they're the genetic anomalies that we're holding back. So therefore, after a handful of generations, we've selected for animals that are lighter or darker, more boldly patterned or less boldly patterned, more speckled or less speckled. But you take that and compare it to a field collected wild strain, you know, or the grandparent lineage or great grandparent lineage, they're probably very, very different. So we're all victims of that, or we all do that ourselves. You know, if we just picked out and said, right, we're going to take a whole back pair from this litter and just blindfold ourselves and randomly pick up one male and one female, that's probably a better way to do it.
And then captivity itself is going to select because, you know, say you have 5 holdbacks and, you know, 2 of them breed much better than the others. They're just adapted to captivity better for whatever reason. So I think it's it's not just it's part of it is our own conscious, you know, desires to pick the animals we like the best, but it's also, I think it's related to just the being in captivity itself. You know, and
we're domesticating
in captivity. Exactly. Yeah, no, we are domesticating. And
yeah,
I really do think of a lot of boas these days as domestic. I mean, a lot of the morph boas, to me, they're domestic animals. And I think they have to be thought of in that way. I mean, maybe we don't quite have the same history as some domestic species. And I don't know offhand what how genetically different they are from the wild animal ancestors compared to, say, a rat or cat or something like that. But I mean, as far as I know, cats are very similar to their wild ancestors, and you know, so I don't know offhand, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of these boas are more different from their wild ancestors than a cat is from its, you know, from I think it's the European wildcat or whatever the wild ancestor of the domestic cat is. I don't know.
Well,
I don't have no data on that.
I know my Argentine boa.
We change their gene pools very dramatically. We're doing with insects in the lab where we're creating genetically diverse populations and then selecting lineages and inbreeding them. And we see genetic differentiation skyrocketing within just 2 to 3 generations. And we're doing that with our boas. We're doing it with our pythons, whatever we breed. If there's any line breeding, we are selecting for lineage-specific traits and lineage-specific lines. We're making them quite genetically distinct from each other, even from individuals from the same lineage, depending on their starting gene pool.
I mean, I know that with my Argentine female, she is not afraid to hiss at me if she's in a bad mood, but I don't get that with my imperators. With my morph boas, it's just not a thing. But she's a little bit more feral, I feel like.
Yeah, that's been reported in Argentines for years. Like I remember 25, 26 years ago going over to a friend in the UK to his collection. He had some Argentines and said every baby was hissy and grumpy. But over the space of a year or two, they really changed their behavior. And as adults were all puppy dog trained. They were wonderful. But everybody I spoke to with Argentines has said that they can be pretty grumpy as babies. Central Americans could be the same thing. Shit, my son is hatching at leopard geckos, and we looked at those today, and they're all jumping up and hissing at us. I think that's just more defensive for some of them.
I think the baby Argentines, they definitely do hiss, but my experience is it's all a bluff. And they never strike, they never bite. All my Argentines have been really docile, even if they hiss. Like I've never been bitten by one. So yeah, when I first started keeping Argentines in the late 90s, and I saw all these reports of how aggressive they supposedly were and how defensive, I was just surprised that mine were so mellow. And that's been my experience with them, since then.
Oh yeah, my girl is.
We are selecting for lines that are also not aggressive whenever we hold back animals.
Yeah, it's
very often.
Too.
Right, we're holding back the best feeders, the most docile, and if you look at the studies that were done on foxes in Russia in the 1970s, 80s, 60s, that looked at inbreeding lines of foxes, and within 6 generations, you got ones with floppy ears, different colors, more docile. I think we're doing the same thing with our boas. So I think that could also be part of it. We're seeing that selection effect occurring, especially now, 30 years on from those early lineages.
Jason, did you have something to say?
I was just saying I have a few morphs that you can take that will give you definitely a run for your money. So it's
I don't doubt that.
It's morph specific, but it's I have some Central Americans that are wonderful, and I have others that look like if they could eat you, they would go for it. So I think it's just very. You have 12 children, and one of them is going to be bad. One of them is going to be that one that gives you a hard time, and then one's going to be that one that's always trying to help you with the other one that gives you a hard time. So, so I think it's.
I'm not doing the 12 children study.
Yeah, have 12 children. Contact Warren; he'll help you out.
So, speaking of morphs, do you guys think that morphs are harming the genetic integrity of wild type boas?
I don't. I think that morphs are basically like a domestic animal at this point. Wild boas are in the wild. What's harming the genetic integrity of wild boas is cutting down the rainforest and, burning and habitat destruction and, highways that run them over, things like that. So I think that when people go on this whole anti-morph or locality versus morph rant, and this is going to be the destruction of the hobby, I think it's kind of ludicrous, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with Brian. In terms of wild versus captive, we're not touching the wild population. Well, we are to some extent, but we're not impacting the wild populations by what we're doing here, unless there's the rare instance where people are collecting wild, breeding them, and putting them back into the wild for conservation. But in terms of morphs, I do think that looking at it from a different perspective, that we may be weakening the animal by adding morphs in. Certain morphs, I think certain morphs are like albinos, for instance. I think specifically T-negative albinos. I feel through my own experience that they are a genetically weaker animal than, let's say, even a T-positive albino or an IMG boa. IMG boa it almost seems like the darker the animal gets, the stronger it is, with the exception of then you throw a pattern variation into it, and that can kind of weaken the animal. But that's just from what I've seen in raising things up, is that I do think morphs, you need to be, and this maybe approaches the inbreeding topic, but you need to be selective. and do things with purpose and understand that there is potential repercussions to certain elements. But morphs will, from what I've seen, weaken the animal under certain conditions and under certain morphs. We know certain ones they'll live for a couple of years and then die. And that's linked. I don't know if it's linked to the morph or what the morph is doing to their body itself, combination of both. But morphs will weaken the animal, so I tend to stay away from certain morphs, and I'll gravitate towards others that are a little bit stronger. I don't want to be producing weak animals. That's not my ultimate end goal.
Yeah, I think there's definitely weaker morphs, and there might be something to what you said, Jason, about the lighter morphs being weaker than the darker morphs. I think a lot of it also has to do with some of the practices that go into morph breeding. The inbreeding. I mean, all of the Kahl albinos are descended from that animal that Peter Kahl had, 30 or 35 or however long years ago. And as Warren said, there was a lot of the inbreeding and that. I think we were talking about the power feeding that went into that. But yeah, I mean, so in essence, those are all, that's a line of boas. They're all descended from the Kahl albino. And you see things like, oh, well, I crossed two unrelated Kahl albinos. And, that's kind of crazy to think about because, of course, they're related. But yeah, and I think also, getting animals up to breeding very young, trying to get money back. I mean, part of the issue with boa breeding in general, especially morph boa breeding, is that there's this underlying push to breed, and it's unlike any other pet hobby where the breeding is such an integral part of it. I mean, you wouldn't go out and buy a dog and then think, well, I want to breed my dog in 18 months and I'm gonna have these puppies and I'm gonna get this one. It's like that doesn't enter your mind, and very few people actually breed dogs. But when you talk to people that get into reptiles, a very large percentage of them have this idea that they're going to breed. And it's with boas, I think boas are harder to breed than many other animals because they have to be older. There's kind of a higher hurdle to get to the breeding size. And there are things about boas that I think prevent a huge amount of babies from becoming available. Right. Whereas with some of the other animals like the ball pythons, where they don't have to be quite as old, and maybe it's a little bit easier to get to a breeding experience, you're maybe going to have the same issues. So yeah, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I think a lot of it has to do with just some of the practices that surround morph boas. But I think there definitely is some truth that some of the morphs are weaker than others. We know that some of the super morphs are, like the super motley is lethal, and we've heard about super jungles as being very unhealthy. So I mean, these are genetic mistakes. They don't just cause the difference in the pattern or color. A gene controls a whole bunch of things, so it's going to cause other things as well. We're basically mutating steps in the pathways that lead to biosynthesis pathways, or we're knocking out certain enzymes which may or may not be critical. So when you affect the color, who knows what else is going to be affected? I mean, it's why, for example, in many dogs that have different mutations, like the Merle mutation in the super form is deaf because it I think it has to do with like the melanocytes in the ear, because you don't have the melanin, you don't have formation of those cells, so you have a deaf dog and they become blind as well. So it's not unreasonable to think that similar things are going on in boas.
Yeah,
Scoria
because when we think about pattern mutations, that's not just impacting pattern. The distribution of the melanocytes, so when they're hitchhiking to other areas of the body, other tissues and so on, and the biosynthetic pathways get really screwed up. So I think Brian really has hit the nail on the head with that one there. The other one is, it comes back to the inbreeding aspect. And I had someone talk to me recently that said, well, I've got these pair of island boas and they're inbred and they're not showing any detrimental effects. And the argument there is that they've had tens of thousands of years of selection going on, right? So from the early founders of those populations, lineages died out that were not adapted to those conditions. And therefore you end up with a very reduced gene pool, but highly adapted to the conditions that they're in. So therefore those lineages can persist with inbreeding because they have selected for certain traits. The deleterious alleles, the variants of genes that are detrimental, have been selected out over thousands and thousands of years. And whenever we get a new albino in or a new whatever, and we're crossing these lines that are genetically very diverse or can be genetically diverse, and then we're inbreeding, what we're doing is we're exposing a lot of these deleterious variants in their deleterious form. And they might be mildly deleterious and therefore survive but have reduced metabolism or reduced fecundity or whatever. Or they might be highly deleterious and just not make it past, either they don't form a viable zygote or they don't live very long. We see those inbreeding effects increasing pretty dramatically over the line, just because they're inbred in a different way. They haven't had those tens of thousands of years of selection where those deleterious variants are selected out of the population.
Yeah, and that's, 2 points. One, on what you said about the kind of chasing the morphs for the money. I think that's very true. And something that you said, Warren, about the inbreeding. I mean, one thing that I think, Adam, you and I discussed this last time is I do, this is a business for me. It's not my sole source of income, and I don't ever want to make it that, because it forces me to do certain things I don't want to do, with animals at least. So I usually wait for kind of price stabilization. I very rarely will buy a high-end, very expensive animal because it's stressful. It puts me under the pressure to raise quickly, breed quickly, and I have to get my return on investment. Where if I buy something that's less expensive, I'm not under that same amount of pressure. It might depreciate. I hate to speak about them as assets or a dollar value, but purely looking at it from the financial side, I won't lose. I can't get hurt if I wait 10 years to breed this thing, or 5 years. I can take my time. It's less stress and pressure. But then also, Warren, what you mentioned about the, breeding certain traits is, if I find, let's say I breed a certain set of boas and there were some that just didn't look right, I usually don't hold back from there, and I'll sell as pet only, or I try to make sure that if I am inbreeding, this is approaching, Adam, your inbreeding topic, and I'm doing it very selectively. So I'm trying to get the strong. If there's a flaw in there, I won't inbreed, because I think there's things we can't see. They're not showing visually. There's plenty of traits that humans pass on, and it's not a visible trait, but it's what we'll call a genetic flaw, for lack of, maybe there's a more scientific term, Warren, but I'll call it that genetic flaw that's getting passed down, but it's not a visible genetic flaw. So the gut issues, certain types of eye issues with albinos. I've had albino to albino and I've had no eye issues, and I've done albino to albino and I've had all eye issues. I mean, year after year, the same pairing will produce no eye issues for albinos. So I think, like, the eye issue with albinos is an easy one because it's a visible thing to pick on.
The T negatives you're talking about, Jason, or the T positives too, or you said you had more of that issue with the T negatives?
So I've seen it with both T negative, T positive. So I mean, I think it's something genetic in them. It could be being brought out even further with the albino inside of it, but maybe albino weakens it even a little bit more. But I've seen it with T positive, T negative. I've seen it right eye, left eye, both eyes. So the whole kind of, it's only the right eye. I've seen it in all different combinations: right eye, left eye, both eyes, T negative, T positive, sharp caul. It just seems to be, which makes me think that it is linked to some type. I haven't seen it in VPI, I should say. VPI, I've seen the underbite. But if they have the overbite, well, underbite, yeah, top kind of short, stubby snout with a longer jaw. Like, I usually wouldn't breed that or recommend breeding that, but it could mean the parents are holding something genetically inside of them that is causing that to occur. So you try to kind of take it for what it is and pick just the strongest stuff out.
I've never seen eye issues in Central American T positives. So I've bred dozens of litters of Nicaraguan T positives, and I've bred a lot of litters of Costa Rican T positives, and I've never seen a single eye issue. I did see a litter produced a couple of weeks ago of VPIs that had some of the eye issues as well. I hadn't seen them in that before. And I think, we could be looking at, there's multiple causes for eye issues, but
I've seen an eye issue where the animals are born missing an eye, and it's not like they shut it out. It's the eye was just never there.
Yeah,
we actually saw that in a couple in a litter of these Honduran fire belly boas. Just one of the litters that I had, and it was like in 2 animals. But yeah, and I don't have I haven't produced too many litters of the albinos, but I did see it in one of my litters of the calls, but I haven't seen it in the VPIs. But that's only based on a few litters.
Yeah, when you see multiple individuals in the same litter expressing the same trait, you've got to think there's probably something heritable to it. You know, you probably had a new mutation on your hands. You would have been millions back in the days. You know, added the scaleless, you got an eyeless scaleless snake, and you're sorted.
I did have one. I had one. It was a junglo, and it was born. Yeah, it was born last year. It had the same the swollen eye, and it just shed out, unfortunately. But beautiful animal. Other than that, and somebody was they wanted it as a pet, and they're very happy with it, and it's doing great. So sometimes these animals are, just because they don't have the eye, they're able to do fine otherwise.
Yeah, so with those eye issues, a lot of times you can save it if you use, I think it's terramycin. It's a gel, an ophthalmic gel. And if you really slather that on the eye continually up until the first shed, then they seem to do fine. I've seen that happen a number of times. And I had that myself. I bred a Cal albino to a het 19 years ago and had 40-something babies, and there was 5 or 6 of them had the bulging eyes with just one eye each. Didn't matter if it was right or left, but they had one of the eyes, and I put that on them, and they cleared up. And it was Jeff Ronnie told me about that years ago. It was the terramycin.
Yeah, he came out with a video last year about that.
Oh, really?
And actually, I meant to pick up a tube of it. I probably should get it now, but actually, I don't have too many. I only have one morph pairing this year, so it's not. I don't need it for this year.
Yeah, I don't breed any T negatives, and I don't even keep Nicaraguan T positives anymore. So
I found the opposite, where when I used terramycin, it made it worse, because what had happened is the animal was just rubbing its eye. It wanted to get this goop off of it. So this was 15, 20 years ago, somebody said put terramycin on it. And I did, and the animal just kept rubbing its eye. And I think terramycin may help for a small bulge, but when you have a more significant bulge, that eye is going to fall out. And usually what I'll do is I'll keep it clean, dry. I won't put that animal in a cage with bedding. I'll just use paper if I can, and I'll let it kind of be drier. The eye typically dries up, falls out, and sheds off. And within 3 or 4 sheds, it just has kind of the socket there, which is sad to see, but it's still a beautiful boa for somebody. And most of the time, those boas thrive. I found the ones with the eye issues are the first ones to eat frozen thawed, because they're relying on different senses, where the ones that can see, they're looking at you come in with the prey. They don't want to eat because they're nervous from you, or sometimes most of the time they eat fine. We're talking about boas here. But the ones that eat really well for me.
Yeah, another thing that I've seen, a vet friend of mine told me that he had some Cal albinos born before, and what he did with those bulging eyes, he used an insulin syringe or an insulin needle and drained off fluid from the eye itself to reduce pressure. And they also shed out fine, and the eyes were fine, and never had a problem after it. So what the underlying cause is, I'm not sure.
Sometimes there's like fluid under the eye, and then sometimes it's literally like there's the eye, and then there's the socket, and there's the eye hanging off the animal. But yeah, I don't use the terramycin anymore, because I just find they rub it and they make it worse. I don't know. It suggests
an eye socket issue, right? About formation of the eye socket itself. If the whole eye is bulging out, and it's not just the fluid under the lens, and it suggests there's actually potentially an eye socket issue, or even ligaments that are holding the eye in place. There could also be some detrimental issues there.
And one of my guys last year had it was a blood boa with a really puffy eye. He brought it over. We did the same thing, took a little insulin syringe, just carefully just nicked it, and a whole bunch of fluid came out. After a few sheds, that boa is looking good again. So I think there's different eye issues. I think some of them are genetic and some of them are developmental. Like the no eye at all. For me, if it was just one animal, I would probably attribute that to a developmental issue inside the womb, as opposed to a genetic issue, but that would just be a pure guess. Warren could probably do some genetic testing on it to figure it out.
Well, if it's one, then I tend to would overlook it. If it's multiple within a litter, then it suggests something else is going on underneath.
Yeah, this was 2 animals, and it was in 1 litter out of, I think, 4 litters that I've had. So it could, it's hard to say. I haven't seen it since, though. And I wonder about the inbreeding, and I don't want to change the topic, but getting back to these micro localities, and we have these Honduran fire belly boas that supposedly are from this island of Roatan. But I've heard people have told me that that's just a marketing story that was made up. And so it's hard to know exactly where these things come from. But I do know that there are likely to be highly inbred at this point, which could have led to that issue with the eye that I saw.
Yeah, the wild boas that I've seen on Roatan look nothing like fire bellies.
Yeah. That's what I think, because they look like mainland Honduran boas that are just more colorful. Yeah. So I'm wondering if they're just someone had these nicely colored Honduran, mainland Honduran boas that they selectively bred, and it was more appealing to call them this. I don't know for sure, because people have told me no, it's real, and I just I can't verify the exact origin of these animals.
Well, Warren, I still would like you to do testing on the Mayan stuff to tell me, is it Yucatan or not?
It's not Yucatan. That whole story, it's all just BS to me. There's too much going on. The fact that it's a T positive and it's a hypo and it's a blood and it's a this and it's a that. My feeling, and I've always felt this for a lot of these things, is that there were pet animals that were wholesaled into the industry, and there were mixes, so therefore they're not locality specific. What I do think you have is a pattern mutation. I definitely believe that. I don't believe the lines underneath it are actually locality specific, but we will. You sent me sheds, and now that we have the genome, we're playing around with more stuff. So we have wild animals from that region. There's a really good database that we have of boas from that region in South America. And we'll be able to determine blindly where they fall into that group. But my feeling is there's just too much going on in there. But I think they look great. I think they look awesome.
They're super cool, and it's been I just like playing with them. I've never crossed them out to other stuff other than the T positive to figure out if it's Nicaraguan, and I got no visible T positives. So you
did visual T positive to visual T positive?
I did visual T positive to het, and out of, I think it was 19 babies, I got 0 visuals, which could just still be terrible.
Yeah, because I had a litter of the boas that I told you about a minute ago, the Cal ones. That was a Caldo, a het. The first year I bred them, I got 48 babies and 0 albinos. The next 2 years later, when I bred it, I got about 20-something albinos, 7 with puffy eyes, and the rest were hets. So I think a single breeding is not really enough to. So if you bred a visual to a visual and you get nothing, then I'm confident at that point.
Yeah, they do look different, but it could just be unrelated. The only reason why I'm still kind of clinging, they could be Yucatan, is when they originally came in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was no reason for somebody to say they were Yucatan boas. Didn't increase their price. It didn't do anything from a marketing perspective way back when they were imported. Now, are they still pure? I don't know, because where did the hypo come in? Where did the T positive? Where did the blood come in? I got F1 generation of them, so somebody could have bred them. When I got them, there was no blood or T positive. That just kind of through breeding, they popped out. But I'd be curious to have you, just
if you could get me one of the original animals. I
still have them.
No, I mean the original that we used to produce those F1s. Yeah, I have no doubt that you could have an animal that was an F1 that was then brought into captivity and bred. Because at that point, we didn't think about localities. We just bred animals to animals. And I think at that point it was probably bred into a lot of the Central American stuff that people were, selling and wholesaling into the trade. The problem with it being F1, there should still be enough genetic signal to be able to hopefully identify some of the locale specific alleles. But a lot of these ones, I see it in some animals in Europe as well that are meant to be locality specific, and all of a sudden, within 3 generations, you've got pure anarthristics, pure albinos, pure hypos, pure motleys, all of this kind of different things, and I'm like,
do you think you can consider anything locality specific if it's 3 generations removed from the founder animals?
If you know the provenance of the animals, the lineage, I think you can. So I think with hog islands, with some, like,
I guess it's a different question. Yeah, a different question. Not that it's impure in the sense that there's no other genetic contribution other than those original founder animals. Mm-hmm. But like you said, things in your insect studies in just a few generations.
You separate. Yeah, I think you can. The reason being is that you're breeding individuals that are from a specific gene pool. So therefore, the genes that are within those animals, while they might be altered in terms of the genetic profile is different than the original founding animals, they're still based on those original founding animals. Now, what happens every generation? You normally get about 20 mutations per gigabase. So if the boa genome is about 2.2 gigabases, I think we're looking at about 40 to 50 new mutations every generation.
Mm-hmm. And so, what was the threshold
in
your
2
species definition? You said about 2%?
Yeah, about 2% divergence. Yeah.
How many generations would that be in captivity?
Oh, who knows with boas? What I will say is any of the boas, the captive boas that we've sequenced, are genetically very depauperate compared to wild. They really don't have the level of genetic diversity you would see. Ball pythons are ridiculously low. We've done a whole bunch of whole genome sequencing on morph ball pythons just for parthenogens and androgens, and they're surviving as real. But they're really low genetic diversity, and boas aren't that far behind them. They, with some of these morph combinations, because they're just inbred. Like, I've been breeding boas, as I say, for about 30 years, and every year people contact me and want to buy a pair or a trio of a specific litter, and they're inbreeding those, and I see 4 years down the line that they're producing offspring from them, so it's just inbreeding going on. But it's one of those things that happens in the hobby. Like as I said, I breed Sonoran boas. Is there any evidence that the leopard is truly Sonoran? There's no evidence that the leopard boa is Sonoran. We know it's a sigma, right? We sequenced that and we know it's a sigma, but we don't know that it came from Sonora. It could came from anywhere in that sigma range. So what we call locality it's all based on who originally collected it and how trustworthy those original people are in maintaining lineages.
Well, I'm going to
But I think just to get back to that, Brian, if the animals have been bred, even if it's selectively bred from animals from a founding stock that are locale pure, I think you can still call them a locality animal.
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of semantics, because I think that the best situation would be to have unrelated, wild caught animals introduced every few generations, but right. Unfortunately, that's not possible with the vast majority of locality boas. So I guess I wonder, like, in the future, at what point are they so removed that even if you did keep them pure, that they're really not, you can't really realistically call them a locality boa? If that makes sense. I mean, what you're talking about with purity issues, that's a totally separate issue, and that's obviously going to have an impact as well. But even if you keep something pure and you avoid inbreeding, at what point is it not really correct to even think of it? I mean, is that 20, 30 years, 100 years? I mean, is it even?
I think it's beyond our lifetimes. But it would be interesting, with the work that we're doing, we're using insects that have a generation time of about 48 days. And, we're sequencing whole genomes at every 48 days to determine, how genetically diverse they become from parental lines. And they do it really quickly with inbreeding. And you see lines that crap out, you see lines that are really successful. And it's just as we see in the hobby with snakes that you inbreed. But, I think inbreeding will occur relatively quickly, but the fact that most boas are breeding at 4 to 7 years of age, and some of them aren't even breeding, I think we're a bit down the line before we can get to
that. How about things like Hog Island? So I avoided getting back into Hog Islands for a long time because I couldn't trust that the Hog Islands that I was seeing were pure. And my problem is, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they looked way different than what they do. In the ones that I was seeing from 2005, 10, 15, 20, they look like somebody had what they made were the sunsets. They took a hypo and bred it in, and then they said, oh, Hog Islands are worth money again. Let me try to breed the Hog Island out. So I just picked up some Hog Islands because I saw what looked to be what I used to see years ago, and I trusted the person I got them from. But do you think that's, I think that really happened heavily, maybe 2015 to 20, when locality stuff just started to skyrocket in price again, and they try to make things that were not pure again and pass it off.
I don't believe it's that bad, I don't believe it's that bad. Like, thousands and thousands of Hog Islands came in. It was crazy the numbers that came in off those islands in a very short period of time. And what happened was the reason we have Sears and Shuett and all of these different lines is because people got a pair or a trio and they started breeding them. And they thought, oh, there's ones that are more speckled or there's ones that are less speckled. I'm going to keep trying for those. And within a handful of generations, they've got animals that are very divergent looking than what the wild type were. And, I breed, I produce a decent number of hog islands. I've got a decent number of animals all from different lines, and I never cross line. I never keep lines pure. So it's always going to be a Sears to a Shuit or a Shuit to a whatever, a University of Arkansas animal or whatever, because I like to outcross. I don't try to go for the, that speckled or speckleless or patternless, whatever. I just try and go for animals that are crossed to produce nice animals. I don't, a lot of people talk about the story that you're talking about, Jason. I don't think it happened to that extent. It certainly happened, unless we've seen them in the blood boas. We've seen them in the hypos to produce sunsets. Whatever happened to the non-hypos, they just got drifted off as pets or sold as hog islands. But I think you can pick up a hog island and you can tell if it's a hog island or not. They've got a specific look. Their face structure is specific. I don't think the story is as bad as people put it out. I think the people that put it out as being really bad are ones that are just trying to get a lot of money for their own animals.
Because for years I couldn't find some that looked good. They looked like, it just didn't look like a hog island. Even once they grew to adults, the adults looked like they had something else in there. And it wasn't just that they were more speckled or less speckled. They're just their whole coloration. And maybe I'm looking at coloration.
There was a specific look that people wanted, though. The lighter ones, the cleaner ones. I mean, so I think that people just kind of selectively bred for that. So that might have contributed to it somewhat. And then I think people got this misunderstanding that is what a hog island boa is. When, there are other types that looked, or other, lines that look different. And, the island, even though it's relatively small, it does have quite a few boas. And from what I understand, the population has rebounded since the collection stopped. So there's still quite a few boas, and probably a lot of, genetic variability there as well. So, but yeah, I think part of it was just people wanted a specific look.
Are hog islands
size as being an issue? But if it's above 5 feet, then it's not a hog island. That's complete BS.
Yeah,
that's
I've seen ones 7 to 8 feet.
Yeah, it's not a genetic trait. We've done genetics. We have a paper on the genetics of hog island boas, and hog islands don't stand out as having genes that are associated with dwarfism. That's a diet specific thing on the island. It's not a gene that's associated with dwarfism. Now, we can keep them small by feeding them less, and I know a lot of people do that, but I've got a hog island downstairs. It's probably 5.5 feet. Eats jumbo rats once every 6 weeks.
Jeez.
She's 20 years old, but I know she's a pure animal because I know the lineage that she came from, and I know the people that got the animals from the wild, that she's an F2. So size can't be something you go by. It's the reason we have a hog island look is because people have selected for a specific look, and it's very different. You go to, yes, the island animals now are abundant. The work that we've done, I think, when collecting, they were finding about 4 every hour. All right, mainly arboreal, small, and arboreal.
How do they live on that density? How are they getting enough food?
Well, that's it. They're small. They're staying small. They're eating birds. They're eating lizards. They're not eating a lot of the big. You rarely find an animal. Like sometimes if you find like a 6-footer, there'll be a big old female, but it'll be broomstick thin because there's not a diet. There's nothing for them to eat that can sustain a 6-foot hog island boa.
But I'll say I have had hog islands years ago. I think in 2010, or probably 2015 is when I got rid of them. And this female I had was huge, and I know she was a pure hog island. She was 7.5 feet, 8 feet long. But she was old. She was approaching 30 years old or so. But she was fed like every other boa. I got her as an older animal from somebody. And I mean, she was big. So I think the thought that hog islands are dwarfs and are going to stay small is a misconception. It's a figment of how they're fed, like you mentioned. I mean, there's a lot of food scarcity on the island that they're on.
Mm-hmm.
So hogs are not dwarf boas?
I wouldn't call them that.
No.
Okay.
They're not. They're certainly not Colombian.
And I think we have to put the dwarf boas. I was asked Warren about if the same thing is true for the Qualqué boas, whether they're how much of it has to do with the food versus how much of it is the genetics. Because there's YouTube video that I saw where someone was actually power feeding a crawl key boa, and it looked like it was 7 or 8 feet. It was crazy, and it was
I
so
think that's a good
overweight.
point. Yeah.
I
I'm actually
have
going to pick up some Kroll Ks and Westerling Ks and so on in a few weeks' time from a guy that actually collected on the island. So Scott Bobach's a really good friend of mine. And I've been doing some genetic work on rattlesnakes for him. So whenever I go over to his university, I'm going to be picking up some of the original stock of Kroll Ks and so on. And he'll tell you that the animals that are there, because they're fed more regularly, they look different than what they were on the island. You know, whenever you've got that ecological release where you've got an animal where you can give it food whenever you want to feed it, no matter what way you feed it, it's going to be different than when it was on the island. We don't know the frequency with which an animal feeds truly on an island. We don't know exactly how many meals it ate every year and so on. So therefore, anything that we keep in captivity will be likely overfed compared to what was happening in the wild. And therefore, you can, I would think, get a Kroll K or a smaller boa up to a larger size. It might not become the size of a Colombian, but it'll certainly be bigger than what it would be on the island.
What actually qualifies as a true dwarf boa? Is there such a thing?
It's whatever you decide you want to call it.
Yeah, and I mean, the dwarfism is a mutation specifically, so really it's a misnomer to call any boa a dwarf because these are just natural. That's their natural, size. They're adapted for food poor environments and they don't get as big. So it's maybe they should be called something else. I mean, if you want to get pure definition of what a dwarf is, because it's really not a dwarf in the true sense of the word.
What are your guys' thoughts on morphs in boa constrictor?
They have them.
Yeah, I've seen albino come in a bunch of times. You've seen aneurystic once or twice. I think there was a hypo at least. You've seen the Roswell is from a constrictor lineage. The cystic is constrictor lineage.
Really?
There's the one that Mike Eckert has that has that connected pattern. I forget what it's called.
Yeah,
what is that called? I think people in general are less interested in morphs that work with true red tails. And I think there's probably going to be less that are popping up just because there's fewer in captivity. I think, as the hobby evolves, the importance of morphs it has changed already, and I think it will continue to change. I think probably what's going to happen is that people are less about the whole chasing the morph and what's the latest, greatest thing. And, they're going to do this pyramid scheme of investing tens of thousands to make back, thousands, and then it's going to sell for hundreds or whatever. I think hopefully people will just be more looking into breeding really good examples of the morph, almost like a dog breed. They want to breed healthy, really nice examples of the morph. Maybe there'll even be some kind of standard for morphs akin to dog breeds. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it would be more like that rather than this constant chasing of new morphs and the whole, a lot of the things that make the morph hobby have kind of a bad, it's not a good thing, but hopefully it'll get away from that.
Yeah, I think recent years the morphs have, or I should say, the locality stuff has taken a big swing in popularity because people were getting a little bored of the morphs. But every time somebody pops out with something new, the whole morph train is going to jump up again. The pied boas are a good example. If pied boas prove out, I don't think they're genetic from what I've seen, which is kind of unfortunate because I like them. But I haven't seen any genetic pieds pop out that I'm aware of. Warren and Brian, maybe you guys know of others. I've seen a lot of the hets.
It's the history but behind that there. So I've got the shed skins from that I'm testing at the moment. They're of those het pieds that were sold as het pieds, the father was not a pied because I've got a shed from him as well.
But
so
even
that was a sketchy breeder originally.
Even the original pied.
Is that the Mexican one that was, is that a Sigma?
Yeah.
Okay.
But even
there's Guatemala and there's a Sigma. There's an Imperator and there's a.
Is the Guatemala? Do you think? Because I know that I'm drawing a blank on his name. I don't think that's a pied. And I
think pied in boas is very different than pied in pythons. People think they're going to look the same, but you look at a pied Brazilian rainbow boa. Look at the recent pied Colombian rainbow boas. They look very similar to the pied boa. you don't get those big blotches of white in the same kind of way that a pied does, but you see pattern disruption. So people would say that the Sigma pied, they thought it was a leopard and a pied. And because the way the pattern broke up, you look at a Brazilian rainbow boa that's a pied, and it has those speckling as well, just like a leopard boa. I think it's the way that the pied works, but we'll be able to confirm that 100% probably within the next 3 months. Because the idea, we know what the pied gene is, we know where it is in other species, so we'll be able to identify it really quickly from the boa genome that we're generating. And as I say, I've got samples from the original pied, I've got samples from the Guatemalan pied, and I've got samples from a lot of those hets produced and double hets pied across to T positive, the Mexican across to T positive. And I think I do believe it's a true recessive genetic trait.
And yeah, because nobody's produced it yet, but I'm curious if it's just or that I'm aware of, nobody has reproduced a genetic pied. I know that the guy over in California,
he's done several of them. Yeah, he's produced several of the Guatemalan pieds. Yeah,
I was going to buy some years ago or a couple years ago, but I couldn't stomach the price that he wanted for some hets, and it was I just there were other reasons, but.
I think he had a pie for sale last year. What was it, 40,000 or 2 years ago? 40,000.
I think it was 60. He wanted 60. Yeah, he said
people think it's high. Look at what ball python mutations have gone for. Look at Ralph Davis paying 80,000 for a patternless, all that kind of stuff. So the money's certainly expensive.
But why I didn't invest in it, because I have no problem spending the money if it actually is there. That would be a different kind of buy than, let's say, buy something for $10,000. But he mentioned he had something like 30 or 60 hets, and I'm saying,
that's your problem. Would you hear that?
Yeah, if I spend $60,000 on this animal and I have to spend 4 or 5 years potentially raising this up, assuming it doesn't die and it raises up, and it was a female pied, he said he would give me an adult het. My concern is I may never get my $125,000. I'm so far behind. If you're not first, you're going to be playing catch up. So I don't like to be first. I'd rather be 1,000th in line.
I think it's a smart way to eventually I will get pied Sigma as long as they've been kept pure. If they've been bred into a bunch of stuff, I don't want them. But I'm hoping to be able to pick some up. But the problem is they're not. The Guatemalan is certainly in the country legally. Yeah. The other ones, there's a totally different story with that there. Because I tried to get T positive Sigma from a breeder in Mexico, and he said, right, well, that's no problem. It's $2,500. He said, I'll ship them from Arizona. And I said, no. No, I want legal export permits from Mexico, and we'll import them in. And he said, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
So, and I tried for 2 years to get legal export permits through Mexico for Sigma, and it wasn't possible. And I'm still working on it through different means, through scientific licenses and through zoos. That's proven to be a real pain in the ass. Yeah. But if I can't get them legally, I don't really want them.
Kind of in the same boat.
Yeah, it's too much risk for me.
At least
right?
At this point, if once somebody's breeding in the United States, then yeah, it may jump in.
Story. Yeah, because then you're buying animals because once they're in, they're considered legal. Right? Once they're produced in captivity in the country, then they're legal animals, but the founding stock is not.
Yeah, there was a guy who I was speaking to. He was in California. It was a really weird conversation that went on for a few weeks, and he wouldn't give me any details. He said, you have to fly down to where I am, and we'll drive across the border and bring a couple $100,000 cash. And I'm like, this sounds like something in
deal or something. Yeah,
like locked up abroad, where all of a sudden here I am in Mexico with couple $100,000 cash. And he said he has produced visible pied babies from the original pied pairings, and they have them in captivity, and he has zoo permits to export them, and it's all taken care of. I'm like, the more
once you got the zoo permits, there's no reason for you to go across the border.
Well, he needed other reason. Yeah. And I'm like, now none of this is adding up. I'm too smart for this, especially to bring $200,000 cash over to Mexico and somebody I don't know from anywhere.
Yeah, you'll walk back with your pants and have no money in your pockets. So.
I met the guy through a few people I know. After some discussions, I figured out who he was, and he was a legitimate person who has a lot of connections. But I'm like, you may have connections to get them in, but do you have connections to get them in legally? Am I going to get a piece of paper that says it's a legal import and it's just something you made on your computer at home? I didn't want to have anything to do with it. He told me I had to pay government officials, and I'm like, nah, I don't want to.
Yeah. And I was hearing that there were bribes and so on that would be required, but I'm not interested in any of that. And animals have to be shipped into a legal court where
Yes.
where they can go through fish and wildlife and they can be proved to be legal. Other than that, it's not worth it for me. It's just a hobby. So.
Yeah. I mean, I had a guy who was just recently, about a year ago, was working to import Tarahumara boas. And he had all the government officials paid off. He had legitimate paperwork, supposedly legitimate paperwork. He said he spent thousands of dollars paying off local officials, and he was from Tarahumara, Mexico, so that's how he kind of knew all the right players. And right before he actually got them over, they closed the U.S. border. There was some law that took effect where you can't. He found some loophole to pay the right people and get them across supposedly legally. But I kept telling him, man, this is a bad idea. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But he was going for it, and right before he hit the end.
What's the point for a $500 snake? Tarahumara, yes. It doesn't matter whether it's outbred or inbred, it's still a $500 snake. And remember that the way locality boas have worked, it's been this wave that goes up and down, just like morphs. Localities do the exact same thing. You know, I remember 25 years ago selling Brazilian rainbow boas for £95 each. And I remember, 5 years ago selling Brazilian rainbow boas for $500, and then they just go up and down. It's just like Tarahumara. It's just like any of the localities. They go up in cycles and down in cycles, So there's no point bringing in a Mexican boa that's a wild type that's worth $500. It's just not. There's just no reason for doing it. Now to bring it in to strengthen your bloodlines for you personally, yeah, that's fine.
But I would extend that to say that for some of the morphs, I mean, I'm not a huge morph person, but to me, the pied is just not that exciting, to be honest. I don't want to, step on you guys' toes or anything, but it's just like, it's just another morph. And at some point, all of the morphs are going to be represented because there's only certain, certain ways that patterns and colors can be rearranged. And like you look at other domestic animals that have all of these different possibilities, and ultimately, and the same thing could happen in boas if we get enough animals, but at some point it's like there's probably not going to be any more. So, and you look at like the ball pythons, and I can't even tell the difference, but not that I'm into ball pythons, but I look at some of these ball pythons, I'm like, that's a morph. How's that a morph? I don't even know what it is, and to me, the best morphs, they have to be spectacular. They have to be obvious. Albino is one, leucocystic, anerythristic, IMG, things that, anybody can look at and be really impressed by. And, I would say that the pied ball python is pretty impressive. So maybe I'm kind of eating my words on the boa thing, but there's only, some of these other boa morphs, I don't even really understand what it's supposed to look like. Maybe it's a slight variability that might be genetic, but is that automatically a morph? Just because it's got a slight, like something like Kraken, for example. What is that even? It's, maybe it looks a little bit different, but is it really, does it have the difference to really support that this is a legitimate morph? And I don't know the answer to that. It depends upon what people, what your definition of a morph is.
We're in the YouTube social media era where everything that looks slightly different has to be, because then you've got your own line, your own lineage, and your own project. Yeah, I see that on some of the online snake or reptile selling kind of pages, and you look at ball pythons especially, and you click on some of those, and you're like, there's no way that is any different than a wild type.
You could say that about some of the localities, because like the whole micro locality idea, like we're going to get a boa from this little small village, and that's a distinct entity, and therefore it's worth twice as much, even though it doesn't look any different. I think the more exclusive that somebody can make something, the more that they can charge for it, and the more hype they can generate. So it gets to be like, I think that's a lot of behind the bloodline issues, where people are just breeding these specific pure bloodlines generation after generation, because they're conflating purity of a bloodline with purity of a locality. And they think that the more pure, the more, exclusive, so to speak, something is, maybe the better it is from a commercial perspective. But no, I think ultimately it's kind of a damaging way to think about boa breeding.
Yeah, and I think the morphs, for me, anything that's genetically repeatable is a morph. And now the how different it is and how variable that determines the price. So, for instance, an IMG versus a jungle or labyrinth, and sometimes there's different. The base income dominant morph like onyx, for instance. Onyx doesn't look like anything special, but then you get a super onyx, and that's a very different animal. So that Kraken, I probably still have Kraken stuff. I somewhat just said the heck with it. It's too complicated to explain it to people, and I'm not passionate about it. I have to be passionate about it. I fell into Kraken because I got one of the original parents, and it's just like a reduced looking hypo. But then the super is pretty funky and unique. And after further digging, I do believe that Kraken came from a funky looking Hog Island that has certain Hog Islands look just like a super Kraken. They have that, almost vertical dorsal
I've got
structure.
one like it.
I didn't mean to knock the Krakens, Jason, and I don't think you shouldn't release the Kraken.
Gone with Krakens.
No, somebody asked me about Kraken the other day, and I told them, maybe I have one right next to me. She's a hypo Hog Island possible Kraken, and I bred her this year.
Whatever you do possible, then it's like.
Well, it's because I don't know what I'm looking at, and I actually think Kraken could be more of an incomplete dominant than an actual dominant gene, or incomplete dominant, or excuse me. I think it could be recessive as opposed to an incomplete dominant, and it works similar to like a leopard. Leopard is a whole other thing. People have debated whether that
leopard's incomplete dominant.
Yeah, so
leopard,
it's
Stricken Black and Hunter and Onyx. They're all incomplete dominant because the heterozygous is a visually identifiable individual. It's got tight bow tie saddles. In some cases, it might just have one where you see that very tight V on one saddle, but it's an identifiable trait. It generally has a head bubble spear. Sometimes it has black eyes, but the heads of those are very visual, and this is why they're definitely incomplete dominant.
But to that point, I was going to mention. I think leopard could be incomplete dominant as well because of that trait where leopard, mixed, Kraken. I think that the incomplete dominant version of that is very subtle, but then the complete dominant version of that is something totally different, like leopard. If somebody was saying this leopard, I have if it was leopard and super leopard, no one would like leopard. Well, shouldn't say some people would like a leopard, but the base leopard, the end goal is the super leopard, which would be the what we're currently calling a leopard. Same thing with Burmese pythons. Het greens are pretty damn visual. Het albinos, to some extent, they do look very different. If I show you a hypo het albino versus a hypo without the het, it's a much brighter looking animal. So could that be incomplete dominant? Probably not. It might just be bleeding through a little bit. For me, incomplete dominant, to kind of what you said, Brian, is do I see it? And immediately can I see that there is something different about this animal? For me, that's what drives the price up, but that doesn't differentiate is it a morph or not. It's whatever somebody is willing to pay. A couple of years ago, Tarahumara boas were $1,500, $2,000. Now I don't know what I'm guessing they're probably going to be about $1,000 this year if they get produced. And certain boas were selling for $2,000 to $3,000 a couple of years ago. Dumerel's boas, people lost their mind when I pushed Dumerel's boas price from $99 to $350, and then the following year to $800. But it set a new standard. I think it just takes that supply and demand curve and somebody to push the barrier. If you put your boas out and in a day they're sold, they probably were either you had a great waiting list and people following, or they were priced too inexpensive for what you have.
I forgot that was your fault, that you're the one that did that to the Dumerel's boas.
Yeah. I'm going to take
the female Dumerels.
People lost their mind at me. They told me I was priced out.
I want to thank you, Jason, for doing that with the Tarahumara, because I was positively affected. Because it's people think $500-$600 is a lot of money for a snake, but when you look at all that it takes to produce these, and you look at the ones that don't make it, as far as breedings, that weren't successful or it's slugged out, you got to factor all that into the whole equation, as far as pricing boas. And the other thing is that the value of some of these animals, a boa is a very valuable animal when you think about how much you're going to get out of it as far as a pet, how long you're going to have it, what you can learn from it. So I think, boas in general, a lot of them are somewhat underpriced, especially, with inflation being what it is and how much more expensive it is to produce boas these days with the price of rodents and electricity. You gotta,
But that's also why
understand why.
I think that's why they're also not reaching the same value that ball pythons are. I think it's because they're harder to breed. I think if they were easy to breed, you had 600 different mutations, then that keeps the price high because you're always going to produce something novel. But I've seen so many people over the years that they started getting into Central American boas because they could put them in the same racks as their ball pythons. Within 3 years, they were back out of Central American boas because they couldn't breed them at 18 months. And they couldn't breed them in a wet paper bag like kind of ball pythons and so on. Therefore that drops the price on them. If they're more difficult to breed, the price is lower. Look at green Sanzinia. Look at green Sanzinia 10 years ago, $350 to $500. The pair of green Sanzinia down here, I turned down an offer of $12,000 for last year. And they're stupidly hard to breed. So that's evening out a little bit, but boas are horrendously underpriced.
Yeah,
but I think part of it is because they're hard to breed. Harder to breed than ball pythons. They're not hard to breed; they're harder to breed.
They're different. I mean, I'm not. I'm a terrible ball python breeder because I was trying to breed them like boas, and they don't breed like that. And once I figured that out, it all fell in line. But I think that it's the mentality of a boa breeder as well. I think a lot of them believe they need to reduce price to sell. This is across all industries. I'm going to undercut. They think that if they paid $1,000 for it, 4 years later, it needs to be $500, and they're bringing the prices down. But Pearl Islands are a good example this year. I mean, I sold my Pearl Islands for $1,200 a piece, $2,200 a pair. There was a person who had them on Morph Market. They weren't. A couple of them weren't good looking, but then I reached out to another person who had some good looking ones, and I said, "Listen, man, you got these things for $300." He says, "Yeah, they're not selling." I told him to put it up to $1,000, and within a week, all of them were sold. So it's perception based too. Is people getting into certain things because they want the animal versus people getting into certain things because they want the investment. Totally different perception. Is if I tell you this is a $300 snake, I don't want to invest 5 years raising this animal, 6 years raising this animal, feeding it. The electric has gone way up, and I mean, with the inflation that's happened, it's natural that the inflation of boas should occur as well, but we keep driving the prices down, and it's not getting cheaper to produce these things. It's getting more expensive, and it'll go through the natural cycle. This happens, as you guys know. I mean, every 5 to 10 years, it flips again. If you go back to 2015, albinos were still a couple $100, $150. Then COVID hit in that 2019 spike, and all of a sudden, albinos are a pretty albino, just a base pretty albino, selling for $500 to $1,000. So the prices did go up, and they stayed there. Our prices for just a pure call, average looking albino boa is more expensive today than it was in 2015. And to me, that's because one, the demand has gone up. We have a larger pool of keepers and breeders getting into the boa hobby, switching from ball pythons, I believe. But the ball python model has somewhat caught up to boas of the pyramid scheme. Buy these two snakes, you can breed it, and you can be a billionaire, which you probably could if you do it. Well, maybe not a billionaire, but you can make a lot of money if you do it the right way. But you have to be selective on what you're doing, and you have to be passionate about it first. There's way easier businesses to get into if you just want to make money. I emphasize that so many times. I mean, go start anything else, a coffee shop, a t-shirt company, go sell online keychains from Alibaba for $1 markup. There's so much easier businesses, but there's a lot that goes into breeding.
I think you also have to have the right mindset, because I think a lot of people that get into breeding boas just don't have the right mindset, and they're not thinking long term. 5 years is basically the minimum for a lot of boa projects to go from a baby to your first litter, and it can easily be 6 or 7 years in some cases. That's a long time for most people. I mean, if you're a young person, that could be like 25% of your life. You can get a college degree in under 5 years. So to put 5 years into something is a long commitment, and a lot of things can change in your life in 5 years. And I've seen so many people that get into not just boas, but the reptile hobby in general, and they go, gung ho, full steam ahead. They're going to breed everything. They're acquiring all kinds of animals. They have a nice collection, and then within a few years, they're just out completely. because for a number of different reasons. But I think you need a long-term perspective. You can't be scared if something doesn't sell. Like as Jason said, there's this. Some people just drop the price. They kind of get desperate. They want to sell, but no, that's in the long term. That's just a really bad thing to do. Just for the whole hobby in general, because there's a certain amount of money that it takes to sustain a breeding operation, and if you're not taking that money in, it's not going to be successful long term.
Yeah, and years ago, people got into this because they liked the animal, and more recently, and there's still plenty of people to get in because they like the animal, but the uptick has changed. Is they're a breeder first, and then they're a reptile keeper, and those are usually the people that you'll see drop out before 5 years occurs. Even if they have one successful or couple successful litters.
It's so many people, though. I mean, you look at people that are just getting in, they've never kept a snake or reptile before, and they're already convinced they're going to be a breeder. I mean, It's like if your first pet dog, and now you want to start a kennel and be, producing puppies in 2 years. This doesn't make sense. I mean, you wouldn't even have that mindset. So I don't understand why it's almost like there's a stigma against people that don't breed. I think maybe because back in the day, 50 years ago, when there weren't a lot of animals in captivity and it was all being taken from the wild, we had to develop captive breeding to sustain the hobby, but that's just not the case anymore. So, a lot of people don't need to be breeding and probably shouldn't really think about breeding. Like you said, Jason, there's so many easier ways. Had I taken all the money I put into boas and had I invested in, Bitcoin or, Google stock or a million other things, I'd be so far ahead financially. But it's the knowledge, it's the experience. You look at the experience you get from breeding boas. I mean, that's really why people do it. They just love the experience, and they love, the whole process. And I think those are the people that are ultimately going to be successful because they love the whole process.
Do you think it's a perspective thing that in the hobby, the breeders are the ones that get the most recognition and respect and admiration? So the people that are, and also so many people that are in the hobby are breeders, whereas dog keepers, the vast majority of people that have a dog are not dog breeders, right? It's kind of the minority of dog breeders. Whereas with snakes, it just seems like it's so much more commonplace to get a pair or a trio of something instead of, going into it and saying, I just want one pet snake, or that's how a lot of people start. And then all of a sudden the next purchase is a pair.
Yeah. And I mean, I have plenty of different people in my Patreon and some of them, and also, but I'll pick on my Patreon folks, and some of them are purely in it for business. Some of them are purely in it for passion. And then there's those hobby breeder passion keepers. And I think as long as they approach it with the right mindset, they're in good shape. Like there's one guy, and he is full speed ahead. And I told him right from the start, listen, if you're going to do this, it's going to be a lot of work and it's going to be a lot of money. You're not going to see a return on that money for a long time. I'm committed. I'm ready for it. And he's exceeding what I thought he would even do in such a short period of time. Then I have other people that just want to dabble in it. I mean, when I started with reptiles in general, I was a little 7-year-old chubby kid running around and still picking my nose and wiping it on the walls. Maybe I wasn't wiping it on the walls. I don't know where I was wiping it, but I was
How much has changed?
No, I was not a booger eater. I could say that. But no, I mean, I was still I was keeping them. I had green tree pythons, carpet pythons, rainbow boas, blood pythons, and I was building this group of animals that I loved. And I think that that's a little different now, where if you don't love it before you build the group, then it's gonna fall flat on you pretty quickly. And where I started breeding was out of necessities. My mother said, "Hey, I'm not going to buy a $10 rat at the pet store anymore. That's not happening." So I said, "All right, well, let me go buy a male and a female, and I'll breed them." And at the time, there weren't a whole lot of morphs, and I was breeding animals and just getting enough to cover their food, and it slowly evolved into a business. But it took. I mean, I've been keeping for over 30 years, and I've been breeding for 25-ish, close to it. I think I had my first litter of animals when I was 12, so 25 years or so. But it just evolved into what it is now, as opposed to I'm going to go start a reptile breeding business. And there's people who are very, very successful at just going, they take a couple $100,000 and they go start a reptile breeding business. I'm not going to name them, but I could. And they're really super successful. But they treat it purely as a business.
How many of those are breeding boas, though? Because it seems like boas don't fit into that model as well as, ball pythons or animals that have a quicker generation time and maybe are more tuned to like the industrial setup of snake breeding.
Most of the people there's only a handful of people that come to mind. They go out and they would buy my collection. I would get out and they would literally buy my business. So they're walking into a fully funded business. I think there needs to be a lot of passion to be able to stick around for 5 years, 4 years minimum, and actually get something going from scratch and ground up. But it still is, my opinion, the best way to do it. When you try to create shortcuts, there's things you're not going to get into. But the people who I'm thinking of, they went and they bought a whole group of animals from somebody. So Brian, if you were getting out of boas, they would buy everything you have all at once with one large capital investment and treat it purely as a capital investment, as a business. And they get great returns because they bought your business.
What do you guys think? Do you think it's better to have big, large scale breeders like that are treating it as a capital investment, or as the people that are more boutique and into very specific things, that would attract a specific customer?
I think you need
I think
both.
a lot of those is, but that's more like animals for the pet industry that, people aren't as concerned about locality or morph or anything like that. They just want a pet boa. There's a lot, I try to produce boas of, different price levels. So I do have some animals that are going to be for a first time pet owner, just a basic normal boa that's, byproduct of a morph breeding, or some of the lesser expensive locality boas that are great as pets. Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for both. I think for most of the people that get really into the hobby, they're not going to be buying much from the industrial producers. They're more going to be targeting the specialists like us that are going to be producing, smaller numbers of maybe a little bit more selective about what they produce.
I kind of want to get into temperature here. I know that, we still got some time. We got like a half hour left. But temperature is, Warren, you keep cooler, and Jason, you keep hotter. So I'm kind of curious, because it's kind of cool to have you both here in the same place where you guys feed so differently, and then you guys keep sort of differently as far as temperatures go as well.
I don't know what Jason keeps at. I keep mine. Yeah, there's probably an ambient of about 84. There's a cool end that they can get to, which will be in the high 70s, and there's a hot spot that will sit up to about 88.
Okay.
So we're pretty similar.
In the winter, I'll drop it. Yeah, in the winter, I'll drop the temperatures down to the high 60s, low 70s at night. But that basking spot during the day as well to offset any cooling.
All right, maybe we're not so similar. So my ambient room is almost always about 76 to 78 degrees. Some spots like towards the floor may get a little cooler, which I keep like my Tarahamaras and different locales that I feel like I need to drop a little cooler. My rainbow boas are down towards the floor, but my and the front ends of my enclosures they're pretty much about 78, 80 degrees. They're a couple degrees warmer than my room. The only thing that I think where we really differentiate would be the summer and wintertime temps, where in my summertime, my cages get hot. I'll boost my hot spot up to 95 to 100 degrees. And then my cool end is in the lowish to mid 80s. And it's for about a 2.5 month period. And then I will drop them hard so that my warm end gets to be, the hot spot is about 86 degrees. So if I have a pregnant female, she can always incubate her babies. And then my cool end stays about 78 degrees or so. My room in the middle of winter gets probably about 75-ish. So my cool end's a couple degrees warmer than that, depending on where they are. Now my males, I do a little different. I don't really heat them up too much. And that's worked for me, but I change a whole bunch of different factors, heat, humidity, lights, feeding. Sure, I'm missing something. I can't change pressure, as where I am in New England just works really well with the pressure change. And I usually tell people that whether this is true or not, you usually need one of those: light, heat, humidity, temperature, pressure. And usually that will trigger a breeding response if you can change those. I know people who actually they have fans that will pull air out of the room and try to reduce the pressure. I don't know if that works or not, but it's a unique idea. And then same thing, they'll reverse the fan. It'll push air in the room and try to increase the pressure. For me, the more factors I change, the more successful I can be with breeding. It didn't happen this year. I'm having a absolutely horrific year of a lot of slugs, but I'm using a lot of younger males, older females, older males, younger females. And I just put multiple males to the same female. Everything I tell people don't do, I'm doing it. And it's because I was trying to push the genetic limits a little bit on certain animals, and it completely backfired. By now I would have 200-300 boas, and I think I have like 25. Just a horrible season. Now I still have 10 or 15 boas that haven't laid yet. And I do think they have good babies just by how they're sitting on the heat, and they just look a certain way. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to really change that because it's worked very well for me. And I would say the first 10 years, I didn't really know what was doing what. So I kind of kept a notebook and took notes of what I did for certain animals. And eventually I'm saying, oh, this is exactly what's happening at certain times. And I got to recognize, all right, this is a female that is growing follicles. This is a male that wants to breed. And by putting all that together, I think is what makes a breeder from somebody who bred, is understanding what the animal is doing and being able to get reproducible results and predictable results, as opposed to just getting lucky by putting two animals together. For me, that's in my mind, that's the difference between a breeder and somebody who has bred animals.
So the reason my room gets cold is because I breed a lot of Sonoran boas. Sonoran boas really need to get cold. Yeah, I've had years where, like, I was lucky whenever I lived in Oklahoma, my basement would get down to 60, 65 degrees. I didn't change the thermostats at all throughout the year. The hot spot was still 88 degrees or thereabouts. Because I like to see whenever a female is gravid, she's carrying babies, I can hit her with a heat gun and she's sitting in the mid range at like 86.8 to 87, somewhere around there. And I know she's carrying a live baby. So she's down in the 82s to 84s. She's generally carrying slugs. Whenever I was in North Carolina breeding Sonoran boas, it was more difficult because my room wouldn't get down to that. I had fewer successful litters. I had more slugs. I think the males need to get low for effective spermatogenesis. Remember that, people used to say that, oh yeah, I put my boa in and I give it 2 weeks rest to rebuild sperm and so on. That doesn't happen in snakes. Boas are producing sperm at one point of the year. And once they've used it all up, they've used it all up. This is why you generally are not successful putting a male boa on multiple females. They spend a lot of time courting and a very short amount of time actually breeding. But when they do, they deplete their sperm loads really heavily. They'll still breed another female, but if they don't have the sperm load, then they're not going to produce offspring from it. So that's why they tend to not do well, because that very long, drawn-out reproductive courting event that goes on. Ball pythons, you put them in once, they because people are using, ultrasound and so on, they can get the breeding done really quickly. Put that male on multiple females before the sperm load is depleted. But to produce viable sperm, boas often need to get cold. At least the boas that I'm working with, the Central American, the Sonorans, they need to get pretty cold. And as a result, I very rarely have slugs in my boa imperator or boa sigma clutches. But if I keep them warmer, then I do.
No, and that's species dependent. Like, I'm looking down at my BCLs towards the bottom. I have my Tarahamaras, my leopards and stuff like that. They're all towards the bottom. And my other less temperature sensitive are towards the higher end. My Pearl Islands are down towards the bottom. Most of my locale and Central American stuff is towards the bottom. Central American seems to just be they just breed so well. But no, I agree. And I broke all my own rules of don't breed your male. Once you let him breed, that's it. Pull him out, he's done. And I put him to multiple males to multiple females. And that was not the smart move. And I knew it. I knew it as I was doing it, but I said, I'm going to try it anyways.
So you moved multiple males around multiple different females?
So I would
So
take the same male. The same male might have 5 females.
Yeah,
and
I would never do that.
Perms, but I know I can't do that with boas, and I did it anyways. So
yeah,
sometimes you just gotta try new things though to see what works. I mean,
I did that years ago, and I first clutch was 100% viable offspring. The second one had about 80% live, 20% slugs, and the third one had about 20% live and 80% slugs. From using a single male, it was a Costa Rican T positive that I used on multiple different females, thinking that I would just give it a shot. He would breed anything. He would breed a stick that you threw into the cage, but it didn't mean he had this viable sperm to actually follow through.
That's what I was hoping. I was hoping just to try to push the genetics out of the certain males. Is I was hoping I could get, I know I'm not going to get full, healthy, beautiful litters of babies, but if I get, a certain amount, if I get 50% of this, it's I was really trying to pull out certain genetic traits for holdbacks for myself, and it completely backfired. So
I wonder whether if we used ultrasound and we only paired the males whenever you see females at a follicle size that is close to ovulation. I think the problem, however, is that it seems with boas, the presence of the male seems to be so triggered into driving that maturation of follicles. So hence the reason you get that really prolonged courting phase, and then once they really go at it, she ovulates within a very short period of time. It's different. With ball pythons, you're attracted. They seem to mature follicles just without the males being present, so you know when to put the males in. I think if you were able to trigger follicular maturation, there's always follicles there. But if you're able to trigger follicular maturation without the presence of a male, you could probably drive those up to a point where they're like 2.5 centimeters. Then introduce the male. They need to breed once or twice, and then you can move that male around different ones. I think that might work.
The ultrasound was I bought an ultrasound just for my own education, and one of the most unique things I found was how the follicles grow throughout the years, every month, and as it get closer. I don't use it much anymore, but what I used it for relate the palpation feel to follicle size, and that's helped me out tremendously. Is when I can really feel follicles, I know about 25-ish millimeters or so. And when my males breed and court, it's only about a 2-week period max, and the female ovulates. But I'll wait, and through using the ultrasound, it's helped me understand, okay, when a female is doing this, how long does it take until it's ovulation ready? As females will stay on the cool side for months before they actually need a male in there. Because of my room, I don't know if introducing a male would help much. Maybe it would, just to encourage the follicle growth. But when my females, once they start growing their follicles, they usually start to continue to grow them. But they're doing certain, sitting on the cool side religiously. And I try not to feed them because I want to keep them on the cold side. If I start feeding them, they'll go to the heat. So just little things that have worked for me. It's not universal for everybody, but that's what I found works for me. And I'll usually breed about 30 to 40-ish boas every season. And I generally say if half of those give me good litters and they give me good, full, healthy litters, I'm in a great shape for the year. Problem is, all my first 8 I got some babies, but they were, one baby out of 16 slugs. And they're beautiful babies. My problem is I probably want to keep them all because they were pushing the genetics on everything. So I got stuff that I really wanted. But we'll see what happens. I may need to sell them just to keep when you're at a certain scale. My bills, if I don't make $50,000-$60,000 a year off boas, I'm probably at a loss. So I need to make sure there's enough fuel to not going to a loss.
And especially with the rodent prices at the moment.
Yeah. That's $20,000-ish a year on rats.
Shoot.
And that's the bulk discounts. That's buying, load up my driveway with these things or drop a couple pallets off. So it gets expensive.
Yeah, I've seen some
I
of those
meant
posts that you put up.
Electricity in California. My electric bill is about $800 a month.
Whoa! Shoot.
I don't even know how much. Most of that is part of it is my family, but we don't use that much power. But and that's a relatively small power consumption. That's how expensive California is.
How do we get solar?
About $50 a kilowatt, 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Yeah, I
My
have
monthly
solar.
bill
So
is my monthly
I have
electricity
some
bill for a
solar
4,000 square
panels
foot home is
and
$225.
what's
My
that?
monthly electricity here for a 4,000 square foot home is $225 a month, and that's including all of my snakes.
Where
That's
do you live? 'Cause I'm
insane.
moving there because my
Yeah,
my
that's
electric
in the south is much less. Yeah, it's
my
it's
electric
crazy
bill in
how
the
much electricity varies.
we are, I think, 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's pretty inexpensive. But in the summertime, my electric bill is about $2,000 to $2,500 a month. So that's a big expense. I mean, that's where now if I removed all the snakes, just because my wife likes to crank the house down to like we're living in a freezer. So in the wintertime, my electric bill is about $1,000 to $1,200 a month. In the summer,
Wow.
the AC kicks on, the pool kicks on, and my wife turns the AC way down. So all of that contributes. But I'm also using the reptile room too to keep my room a little cooler uh,
Mhm.
in the summer as well, or it'll get too warm in the room.
Wow. I
Wow.
think if my bill was anywhere near that, I would be not keeping reptiles anymore. I'd just be collecting guitars.
The thought that's crossed my mind, Warren, is maybe I should pick a less expensive hobby, but
Yeah.
I because I like it, and as long as I can cover my bills for the year,
That's the way I work. Yeah. That's the same as me.
Um, we've talked quite a bit about breeding. What are some of the risks of breeding boas, and how can you minimize them? And I kind of have actually. Let me ask this question first, and then we'll get into that kind of open discussion. When I breed my Argentine, how important is it for her to have heat throughout the night? Does she need it? Is that, and I know this probably sounds stupid. Maybe, I don't know. I have overhead, heat bulbs that I use. When she's gravid, is she going to need a heat panel to give her that 80 something hotspot all throughout the night?
Or what can she bask at? What with your heat light the way you've got it? What temperature can she raise her body temperature to?
Like during the day?
Yeah, so if she's underneath it basking, if you hit her with a infrared,
Anywhere from 88 to
yeah,
92,
she's fine.
depending on the.
Yeah, she's
Okay.
totally fine. Yeah. I think temperature at night, as long as you're not going stupid, but for Argentines, they get cold in the wild at night. So getting them down into the high 60s is not going to hurt her. I've talked to people that said they've brought theirs down to the 50s. With my green Sanzanian next year, I'm expecting to bring them down into the mid to low 50s at night, but they'll have a small heat bulb during the day. But I think as long as you can offset that really cold night with a way for them to raise their body temperature, they should be fine. Now, once they're gravid, then I think you need to be able to provide a constant basking spot, and I think that needs to be a spot that's elevated from the ambient. I don't know any boa breeders that are successful having an ambient room with no elevated heat spots.
So so once gravid, she will need a hot spot throughout the night.
Okay. But yeah, I keep a hot spot continually for gravid females. Once I come out of my winter cycling, so I don't have a daytime nighttime temperature difference. During the regular part of the year, during the winter, that's whenever I do the nighttime. I just turn off the heat essentially.
Yeah.
And then during the day, they got their regular temperatures. But when gravid, once I bring them out, and once I hit March 1st, then they're back to the regular hot spot of around 88 degrees. So somewhere around there, ambient 84, cool end 78.
Okay.
And then she'll regulate where she goes. I watched it with emerald tree boas. I watch it with regular boas and so on, boa infrata and boa sigma. A lot of them will sit on the heat a lot. Then during some part of the day, they'll move away and they'll cool down a little bit. And then they'll move back on the heat, just regulate their temperatures the way they want it. But you want to be able to offer a thermal gradient where they can get cold if they need to and then get warm if they need to. And they can choose where, if they're constantly always on the heat, it suggests that it's not hot enough, right? And that you need to be able to offer a better thermal regulation for the.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's because that's been a thought of mine. Is I don't use radiant heat panels right now in my cages, but I'm assuming that once the time comes and she's gravid, then I'll definitely need to install one of those.
I would install.
I find that sometimes, or even just under like heat mats, under the heat from below, like flex watt or a similar type of thing. If you have enough animal heat things in the room, they will raise the ambient temperature somewhat, even if it's not giving off a huge amount of heat. per each, heat mat. But I find sometimes it's easier to maintain a gravid female with heat from below than heat from above. Sometimes it's a little more variable, especially if you have a large cage. Sometimes I'll use both. And I've, like Warren said, with gravid females, I always give them that, constant 88 to 90 degree spot. And usually once they're gravid, usually they don't move a whole lot from that spot. If an animal isn't gravid, it's typically not going to be sitting on that spot. With true red tails, I find that they rarely will hang out on the hot spot unless they're gravid. And that's a pretty clear sign to me that a female's gravid if she's constantly hanging out on the hot spot.
So that'll be maybe even just a heat, like a heat pad or something that she can get on top of that I can just put it in there when she's gravid then.
And that, or just change your heat. If you got a heat bulb that you're using, just change it to a red or a blue light, something that's less sensitive to the animal. It's going to cause stress of a 24-hour light cycle.
That's true. Yeah.
I think what will happen is if you have a few days here and there where they can't get to that temperature, it'll be fine. But if you have sustained nighttime temperatures, you're probably going to end up with underdeveloped and big yolk sacs. So I found that the snakes, for instance, I've kept certain snakes on the bottom and they couldn't quite get to that 86, 88 degrees. They were sitting around that 84. Most of those litters were born a little underdeveloped because they still lay them around the same time frame, but they weren't fully cooked. They needed more heat. Same thing will happen with like Burmese python eggs, and I don't know about colubrids, but I would imagine the same thing. Because my colubrids I just put on the top of my racks and I don't even throw them in the incubator. But if a Burmese python, if you don't get them that temperature, that 88 or so, 86 degrees for the eggs either won't hatch or when they do, they'll be delayed. So my Burmese python eggs, if I incubate them at 90 degrees, around day 55 to 60, they'll hatch. If I put them at 88, around 60 to 70, and if I put them cooler than that, like 86 degrees, they're more in that 65-day range. But I think boas they're gonna lay at the right time period no matter what. At least boa constrictor and my BCCs and BCIs, things like that.
So I'll say something interesting about my boas. So I breed mainly Central Americans, and we talk about the classic 104 days post-ovulation shed is whenever they drop. I get viable litters that are healthy from day 90 to about my Central Americans are generally day 90 to day 97 to 99. I don't think I've ever had a Central American go past 100 days. Colombians, I've had them go up to the 104, 106, 108 days, but Centrals, and they come out no yolk sacs, they're ready to go. I remember I had a leopard litter in Raleigh, so 17 years ago. And she had 24 babies and born on day 89 or 90. Just there was a massive storm came through and I could see her getting active and I thought, right, this is not going to be a good sign. And she dropped. There was no slugs, 24 viable babies.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've seen the same with Central Americans I've worked with. It's about 90 to 95 days. With BCC, it's longer. It's about 120 days. So, there is variability in the time of gestation of these different boas.
Yeah. It's just like the 9 months for people is they're born early and they're born late. It's a range. It's a good guideline, but it's variable. I think too many people get caught up. My boa's at 105 days, hasn't laid yet. Well, it's probably fine if it's actually pregnant. I had my Pearl Island. I thought she was going to die and she looked horrible. And she laid 16 perfect babies, no slugs, and I think she was at 124 past shed. I mean, I'm like, this snake looks terrible, and she looks great now. She just ate a giant rat, and it's just variable.
Wow. All right. Well, and I think that's probably a good idea, Jason. Just throw a ceramic heat emitter or something in there when the time comes, and put that on a herpstat and let it do its thing for that.
Yeah, you
time
see those deep heat emitters.
Yeah,
they
I've
look
got
like
a bunch of them.
They don't generate any light. You put that in as long as you've got a ceramic holder. So that's the big thing that people sometimes forget. They put it in a regular light bulb holder. It melts within 15 minutes. But you put that into a ceramic light fitting and put it on a thermostat, and you'll be totally fine. They're $30 or $40.
Yeah, one
Yeah,
of
there
these
you
right
go.
here.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a
You could
ton of them.
try like a radiant heat panel. I
Yeah.
have those in some of my cages, and I don't think they get quite as hot as those ceramic
Okay.
elements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I use the heat panels for all of my Corrales and all of my Sens India, and they work great. I know people talk about them drying out the air, but I don't really seem to have an issue. I never have shedding issues with any of my emeralds and stuff. So as long as you keep up the humidity, you're fine.
All right, we got 5 minutes. So risks of breeding and how can you minimize them? We'll start with Brian, and then we'll go Jason and Warren.
Okay, well, unfortunately, there's no way to completely reduce the risks of breeding. As you know, the best thing you can do is not breed a female that's not ready. You want to make sure the female is of the right age and size and body mass. It's a very bad idea to breed females 2 years in a row. I did it once and I got a good litter the first year. The second litter, she delivered early and they were all stillborns, and I never did that mistake again. Don't breed a female if she's not ready. I mean, sometimes even after 2 years, a female isn't going to be ready to breed. Don't hurry. I mean, when I was first starting out, sometimes I had tried breeding animals that maybe were kind of borderline. Maybe they were 4 years old, and maybe they would have been better to go to the next year, and we resulted in small litters or slugs, stillborns, that kind of thing. So you really can't push it. You want to breed the animals that are of the right body condition, and just don't cut any corners. Is your best thing that you can do to not have things happen. But ultimately, sometimes it's just not in the cards. And I have a couple times I've lost gravid females that, for whatever reason, it's just too much stress on their body, and it's always heartbreaking to have something like that happen. I've had a few litters that have been either stillborns and slugs. Luckily the female recovers and goes on. But unfortunately, it's breeding anything is never going to be 100% safe, and it really puts the animals in a vulnerable state, and you really have to accept that if you're going to be breeding them.
Yeah, I'd say everything Brian said, and I like my females going into breeding a little heavy, and main reason for that, I mean, not overweight, but if you were a person, you wouldn't have a 6-pack of abs at this point. So I like them going into it a lot of the ideal boa condition is like the person who has a constant 6-pack for or something, and I like them going in a little bit heavy because they are going to lose weight in the process, and the complications during pregnancy they can't speak, so they can't tell you, and it's very difficult to figure out if something's going wrong. Be very gentle with them. Don't handle them during this period because you risk damaging a baby inside or popping an embryo. So I would say patience, number one, is take your time. If you're questioning, should you skip the year? Just skip the year. I'll never go in with a questionable, should this animal go, should it not? Even if I really want to get that pairing, I'd rather just wait the year. This is a long game with boa breeding, and really breeding anything in general is the long game. Patience pays. Go in a little bit heavy, and I do breed back to back on certain animals, but it needs to be specific. I have one female; she's bred 8 years in a row for me. Now she's getting older, and I found the older animals don't bounce back the same as younger animals do. Younger animals will put the weight back on, but they need to have that weight going into the breeding. And if they don't, I'll skip the year, and that's just part of the process. So patience, make sure they have good weight, and if you're questioning what's going on, then don't do it. And if you absolutely cannot fathom losing that animal, then you should not breed that animal because there's things that you just can't predict for and can't prevent.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think there's 3 things there that I can build on. One is rebinding animals at the end. I think once they give birth, you need to really put effort into feeding those animals. So what I do with mine is I give them small meals, but very frequently, maybe every 5 days, just to get them through about a month or 6 weeks of getting frequent meals, and that seems to help them recover really quickly. And then they go back on their regular schedule. I think don't be afraid to feed your snake when it's gravid. I offer all of mine food. Now, I don't offer them a big meal. I drop the meal size right down, but every single one of them eats. Like, it's very rarely for me to have a boa that's gravid that won't eat. And I'll find that once they give birth, they're not in that kind of sag bag of skin that they would be if they hadn't fed. So, for example, I've got a Sonoran boa downstairs that I produced 12 or 14 years ago. I didn't breed her until she was 8. She grew slowly. She was small, but she produced a nice healthy litter 4 or 6 years ago. I didn't breed her again since then. She's gravid now. And she is small, but I feed her. She'll get an adult mouse or jumbo mouse while gravid every couple of weeks. So I think it's fine to feed your snakes. You know, in the wild they would do it. So why do we need to stop them? If they got that feeding response, they're going to feed. I don't think it's going to damage the offspring. And the other one is when you're breeding your snakes, I think think more about age than about size. I'd say like the Sonoran boa, it's really tiny, but it produces really viable and healthy offspring. You know, whenever they're in that kind of loaf, I like to think of my boas, my females, as being in that kind of, they look like a loaf of bread. You know, they're square sided, they're not fat. Whenever you've got that kind of body shape and at the right age, doesn't matter what size they are, they will produce. But as long as they got the age to them, and that's one of the reasons I raise my boas kind of slowly, and I feed them not as frequently as many people do. And some of my boas will be a lot smaller whenever I breed them.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up the boa symposium. We'll have to do it again. We got through, I think, like half the topics. But
we should do a round 2.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Some great.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate your time, and it was great having you on.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been great. Yeah. Great conversation.
Cool.
Have a great weekend.